A 6-year-old boy poisoned his father's advisors during a private banquet, and no one ever found out. This is the story of Darth Vowrawn, the hidden emperor, the Sith who laughed at death. Before his name echoed in council chambers, before he shaped galactic policy with a single glance, he was just a child, alone in a fortress that smelled of silk, blood, and stormwater. The boy was born into one of the oldest noble bloodlines on Dromund-Kars, a house of wealth, influence, and ancient Sith loyalty, loyal not to the dark side, but to survival. While most children were taught to kneel before the Emperor, Vowrawn was taught how to bow without submitting, how to smile without showing fear, and how to listen for things never said aloud. The storms on Dromund-Kars never stopped. They cracked across the skies like warnings from the Force itself. But to Vowrawn, they were lullabies. He would sit at the window in silence, staring into the endless lightning as voices whispered behind him, his mother entertaining senators, his father negotiating planetary resource rights, his siblings being trained to obey. But Vowrawn didn't want obedience. He wanted options. His Force sensitivity was not dramatic. No collapsing rooms or broken objects, just patterns, awareness, a gaze that unsettled guests, a calm that made lords nervous. Tutors reported he was far too polite. Bodyguards never noticed him leaving rooms. Servants found documents rearranged after he walked by. He didn't lash out, he observed. The first time he killed, it was called a sickness, a sudden fever that spread across his father's council, sparing only those who had once praised the boy's wit. Vowrawn sat by the fire that night, legs crossed, listening to the servants whisper about tragedy. He never smiled, not once, but the next morning, he requested the advisors' roles be reassigned, and they were. No questions asked. The Sith who would one day rule the Empire never saw a battlefield in his youth. He walked through marble halls instead, listening to footsteps echo behind him. He memorized the voice of every guest, the meaning of every silence. Every tutor was a lesson. Every punishment was data. He didn't resist cruelty, he learned from it. His parents suspected something, but it was too late. His father called him gifted. His mother called him delicate. But in the middle of the night, Vowrawn practiced mental techniques older than the Empire itself. Techniques passed through databanks hidden in private libraries. Encrypted Sith doctrines only children would be ignored for reading. He studied how to mask his presence in the Force, how to shift his emotions like clothing, how to lie with his eyes, and how to speak truth in a way that always served him. Dromund-Kars taught him discipline. The storm taught him rhythm. And the people, they taught him that power didn't scream. It whispered. And so did he. By age 10, he had memorized every member of the Dark Council. By 12, he could recite every major corporate merger across Imperial space. By 13, he already knew the date of his father's death because he had set it in motion. There was no ceremony, no drama, just a quiet evening, a glass too full, a will too clean, and a family too distracted by their own ambitions to notice the son who never asked for anything, now owning everything. Outside, the thunder rolled as it always had. Inside, a boy stood at the window and smiled. The Sith Order never noticed when Vowrawn arrived. There were no announcements, no fanfare, only a datapad marked with a name too noble to question and a recommendation too clean to deny. He entered the Sith Academy on Dromund-Kars under the guise of tradition, one more child of influence sent to prove his worth. But Vowrawn didn't come to prove anything. He came to watch them lose. Most acolytes bled their way to power, clawing for favor, testing their strength, striking down their peers in ritual duels that fed the Academy's thirst for violence. But Vowrawn offered no threat. He was quiet, curious, unarmed. He wore his robes like silk armor, moved like wind through stone corridors, and answered questions with compliments that made instructors feel wiser than they were. No one remembered when he first stood out, but they remembered how safe they felt around him, until they weren't. He never fought for rank. His trials were passed through precision, not passion. When asked to confront his fears, he offered no resistance, only acceptance. When challenged in combat, he yielded, only to have his challenger collapse from exhaustion hours later in a training hall, poisoned by his own ambition. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was always the last one standing. In private, masters questioned his lack of aggression. They called him too controlled, too careful. One even warned he lacked the hunger to survive the Sith. That same master's promotion fell through weeks later after a quiet scandal involving forged documents. Documents only Vowrawn had access to during his administrative rotation. Still, no one accused him. He didn't need a lightsaber to kill. He used patience, charm, timing, and the Force, not as a weapon, but as an echo. A gentle hum beneath everything he said, so subtle it passed unnoticed until the listener's mind began to bend. Among the other acolytes, he became a myth. They whispered stories of his voice calming beasts in the training pits, of instructors inexplicably favoring him despite his lack of violence, of rivals who were dismissed for reasons that made no sense until you remembered their last conversation was with Vowrawn. And yet, he never claimed credit, never offered threats, just soft words, always smiling, always listening. Even the most ruthless students avoided him, not from fear, but uncertainty. He was the shadow at the end of the hall, the figure in the archives long after curfew, the one who never raised his voice, because he never needed to. He studied the Sith code not as a scripture, but as a map. Peace is a lie, they all recited. But Vowrawn understood what came next better than most. Through victory, his chains would break. But first, he would let others forge the chains themselves. He let them win arguments, let them claim titles, let them believe he had no ambition. And all the while, he wove himself deeper into the political structure, advising, suggesting, observing. He never reached for power. He made power come to him. By the end of his training, he had no scars, no enemies, only a list of powerful names who owed him favors and didn't realize it. When he was finally assigned to a Sith Lord as an apprentice, the decision came from someone who didn't remember recommending him. His lord would later describe Vowrawn as pleasant, if unnerving. But before the assignment began, Vowrawn took one last walk through the academy alone. He paused in the dueling arena where hundreds had fought, bled, and died to be noticed. He stood in silence, then whispered, almost sadly, too loud, and walked away. Vowrawn's apprenticeship began without ceremony. No gathering of acolytes, no ritual oath. His new master, Darth Vowrawn, barely acknowledged him when he arrived. The Sith Lord was a strategist known for cold logic and colder punishments, a man who believed emotion was a flaw. But even he did not see the quiet storm standing at his door. Vowrawn entered the estate with nothing but a single datapad and a bow so smooth it felt like silk. Vowrawn raised an eyebrow, waiting for fear or awe or the usual eagerness of new apprentices. Instead, Vowrawn simply stood in silence, watching the room the same way a painter studies a canvas he already plans to repaint. Vowrawn dismissed him to observe and learn. He didn't realize how literally Vowrawn would take those words. Within days, the boy had memorized the estate layout, the guard rotations, the hidden compartments in the walls, and the schedule of every servant. He learned which data pads Iridios read before bed, which he hid from guests and which he pretended not to use. He learned the man's voice patterns, his breathing habits, the small twitch in his right hand when he regretted a decision. But most of all, he learned the gaps, the moments Iridios didn't speak, the silences that revealed more than any lesson. Vowrawn never pushed for training. He never demanded instruction. He simply positioned himself where his master needed him most before Iridios even realized he needed anything. When political rivals sent subtle threats, Vowrawn intercepted the messages, rewrote them, and delivered versions that made Iridios look wise and untouchable. When the estate's internal accounts became strained, Vowrawn discreetly rerouted funds from a forgotten grant file Iridios hadn't checked in years. Every success was credited to Iridios. Every solution arrived with perfect timing. Every obstacle faded without anyone understanding why. Iridios began to trust him, then rely on him, then depend on him. And still, he never realized what was happening. The first true test came when a rival Sith Lord, Darth Vowrawn, moved to erase Iridios from the Dark Council's political map. Not through lightsabers, but influence bribed senators, whispered rumors, falsified documents. Iridios panicked in private, unsure how to counter such a wide net of attacks. But Vowrawn had already watched Kallus for years. He understood the man's pride, his appetites, his secrets buried beneath polished armor. And so Vowrawn acted with the same gentle precision that had shaped his childhood. He forged a message, not a threat, not a warning, a single line of praise written in Iridios' signature, delivered to Kallus through a channel that appeared compromised. Kallus, paranoid and prideful, believed Iridios was baiting him. The rival Sith struck too early, too publicly, too loudly. The Dark Council intervened. Kallus was stripped of half his influence. Iridios survived. The victory stunned Iridios. He couldn't explain it. He thought it luck, fate, a rare moment where the Force chose to favor him. Vowrawn said nothing. He simply bowed again, offering quiet congratulations. It was during this calm that Iridios finally saw something he hadn't before: not power, not ambition, but inevitability. There was no moment when Vowrawn became dangerous. He simply always had been. Iridios sensed it too late, like feeling a dagger's cold edge only after it's already touched the skin. One night, Iridios summoned him to the private meditation chamber. "Who taught you to observe so deeply?" the Sith Lord asked. Vowrawn lowered his gaze, offering the soft, measured smile that would one day terrify entire councils. "No one, my lord," he whispered. "I simply listen." And Iridios said nothing more, because he finally understood. He didn't have an apprentice. He had a successor. It ended the way many Sith paths do, not with fire, but silence. By the time Vowrawn reached his late teenage years, he was no longer just an apprentice. He was a presence, a shadow that passed through every conversation Iridios had, an invisible hand in every decision made. Yet no one outside the estate spoke his name. No record listed him. No rival acknowledged him. To the Sith world, he didn't exist, and that suited him perfectly. When a Sith Lord dies, the assumption is always violence: a blade, a duel, a betrayal soaked in crimson. But for Vowrawn, violence was too loud, too final. He preferred rot over rupture, decay over detonation. He began small. A forged signature here, a misplaced communique there. He rerouted the staff's loyalties with quiet gifts, settled old debts on Iridios's behalf, then reminded the beneficiaries who had truly paid. He created conflict where none existed between estate officers, between allies, between friends. Then he offered solutions. Slowly, methodically, he became the one person Iridios couldn't function without. And then, he withdrew. Not entirely, not enough to draw suspicion, but just enough to make Iridios feel the absence. His confidence cracked, his memory faltered, old paranoia returned, and when the rumors started, whispers of falsified records, questions about unauthorized fund transfers, Vowrawn offered no defense. Just presence, just concern. "I'll fix this, my lord," he said once, his voice barely above the wind. "But the council has long memories. It may be wiser to step aside." Iridios hesitated. He searched for an enemy, a traitor, a knife in the dark. But all he found was a calm, devoted apprentice, and an empire that no longer feared him. Weeks later, Iridios vanished. No body, no message, no trace. Officially, he retired to private meditation on a remote world. Unofficially, no one asked. Vowrawn inherited nothing. There was no will, no claim. And yet, within days, he held control over Iridios's networks, his holdings, his influence. The void had been prepared long before the disappearance, and the galaxy hates a void. The Dark Council approved his petition for ascension unanimously. No one objected, because no one truly understood how he got there. Vowrawn didn't celebrate, he simply continued. His robe stayed the same, dark crimson trimmed in subtle gold. Elegant but never ostentatious. He did not roar, he did not rage, but when he spoke, lords leaned forward. When he entered a room, whispers died. His first act as a Darth was to erase every trace of his apprenticeship. No records, no lineage, no ties. He wanted no legacy but his own. And so, Darth Vowrawn became a ghost in the council, present, powerful, yet always untouched. Where others burned worlds or led armies, he restructured trade corridors. Where others dueled, he debated. Where others demanded loyalty, he made it inevitable. But those who underestimated him vanished. Some said he used poison, others said words. The truth was simpler. He used nothing. He let others destroy themselves. Vowrawn understood something most Sith ignored, that fear is not the key to power, nor love, nor even the Force itself. The key is belief. And Vowrawn knew how to make others believe. Believe they were safe. Believe they were clever. Believe he wasn't a threat. Until one day, they weren't. By the end of his first year as a Sith Lord, Vowrawn had fewer enemies than when he began. Because the smart ones joined him, and the rest simply stopped appearing in public. His rise wasn't marked by fire or thunder. It was marked by a smile, small, measured, and sharper than any blade. The Sith Academy on Drummond Cars was not built to educate. It was built to destroy everything soft inside a being and see what remained. The Force did not matter unless it was weaponized. Pain was the lesson. Survival was the reward. No one cared who you were before. No one asked where you came from. The only name that mattered was the last one standing. And still, Vowrawn smiled. He returned to the academy, not as a frightened child, nor as a formal apprentice. His former master, Darth Iridios, had vanished under circumstances too quiet for anyone to question. There was no sponsorship to protect him, no official declaration to support his ascension. But in a place where hierarchy ruled and fear fed the walls, Vowrawn had already learned that a title was only power if others believed it was. So he made them believe. He walked into the council halls like someone who belonged and no one stopped him. Not because he was feared, but because he was unnoticed. That was always the trick. Never draw the blade first. Let others reveal themselves. Then speak softly enough to make them question what they had said. There were lords who had earned their rank through centuries of combat, Sith who had slain monsters on Yavin 4, broken Jedi on the battlefields of Malachor, or torn rivals apart in the ritual pits. Vowrawn had done none of those things, and yet, when he spoke, they waited. When he advised, they listened. Not because he was strong, but because he made them feel clever. He understood the council's rhythm, the way ambition disguised itself as concern, the way lords insulted one another with praise, the way small gestures a turned head, a brief silence, a missed invitation carried more weight than any decree. It wasn't enough to survive, not for him. He intended to ascend. He began with the low seats, the outer lords, the ones desperate to be noticed, the ones afraid of fading before their names were remembered. He fed their hunger, flattered their fears. He warned of plots that didn't exist and praised actions that hadn't happened yet. He whispered carefully, never directly, and always to the right person at the wrong moment. Soon, his name returned in conversation. Always second-hand, always as a suggestion. Lord Vowrawn mentioned that possibility once. I believe Vowrawn foresaw this outcome, though he remained discreet. Perhaps we should consult with Vowrawn. He sees the shape of things. And in time, the academy adjusted. Instructors who once ignored him began requesting his insight. Records were rewritten to retroactively name him as Iridios's final apprentice. A clerical note approved by someone who couldn't remember signing it. Students who once mocked him began mimicking his posture, his speech patterns, even his phrasing. Grace over force, they called it, as if it were a new philosophy. But Vowrawn wasn't teaching. He was building. A web, a network of lords, acolytes, stewards, and spies who didn't know they served him, only that their next opportunity always came after speaking with him. He never demanded loyalty. He allowed it to bloom naturally, like a flower fed by suggestion. Each victory was silent, each advancement subtle. There was no celebration, no formal duel, just progress, just presence. Even his enemies found it hard to hate him, because to hate someone, you must know where they stand. And Vowrawn never stood anywhere long enough. He moved like smoke, smiled like nothing mattered, but the fire followed wherever he went. There was a duel every morning at the Sith Academy. Someone always fell. Sometimes they got up, sometimes they didn't. There were no mourning periods, no funerals, no second chances. Death was a lesson. Mercy was weakness. But Vowrawn never drew his blade. Other acolytes noticed. They whispered about it, questioned it, even mocked it. How could one be Sith without proving dominance? Without ritual combat, scars, or bleeding crystals? Some thought he feared humiliation. Others believed he was hiding a flaw, a lack of strength, or worse, a lack of will. They weren't wrong. He didn't want to win a duel. He wanted to make duels unnecessary. When challenged, he deferred, gracefully, always with a bow, always with a compliment. "Your blade deserves an audience more worthy than me," he once said to a furious rival. That rival was later expelled for the murder of an instructor, a murder that Vowrawn privately revealed to the council. with evidence no one asked how he obtained. He mastered evasion, not through the Force, but through people. He was never the loudest, never the most violent, never the most feared. But he was always the one whose absence made the room feel colder. That was his skill, the art of subtraction. Removing threats before they became enemies. Erasing questions before they became rumors. Letting others believe they stood taller by stepping around him. He was like a blade with no hilt. Beautiful, lethal, but no one ever touched it. There were instructors who tried to test him. Sith who had seen too many like him. Fail clever talkers, smiling cowards. Charmers who broke when the fire reached their bones. They crafted trials not of combat but cruelty, public humiliation, impossible riddles, meditation in freezing cells, sleep deprivation. The kind of slow pain that broke the mind before the body. And Vowrawn endured, not by resisting, by yielding. He didn't deny fear. He described it. He didn't hide his pain. He analyzed it. In one lesson, while suspended above a void with only the Force to hold him, he calmly recited each Sith code variation across 12 ancient dialects and corrected the instructor mid-lesson. They began to fear him, but not for what he could do, for what they couldn't control. One overseer reported that Vowrawn's aura was quiet, but bottomless, as if the Force within him wasn't screaming to be released like others, but waiting, like an ocean held still by glass. When it came time for the final proving the last test before full ascension, most acolytes were summoned to the arena. To fight, to bleed, to kill a peer or die. Vowrawn was sent somewhere else. The archives. At first, he said nothing. He spent 3 days within the vaulted chamber, analyzing holocrons and ancient texts without food, without sleep. On the 4th morning, he emerged and handed his proctor a sealed data card. It contained the history of every Sith Lord who had sat on the council in the last century, including names, heresies, deviations from doctrine, alliances, and crimes not yet discovered. The information was precise, untraceable, and utterly devastating. He was promoted immediately, not for what he destroyed, but for knowing what could be destroyed and choosing not to. They gave him the title of Lord, but it was just a label. Vowrawn had already moved beyond titles. He had become the thing Sith feared the most. Not rage, not power, but control. The Sith did not believe in allies, only tools. Each relationship was a calculation, a wager of strength. A temporary illusion of trust meant to be shattered the moment it no longer served survival. But Vowrawn saw something deeper, not in emotion, not in bonds, but in leverage. Every ally was a door, and every door led to someone else's fear. He didn't collect apprentices, he collected secrets, administrators, messengers, stewards of noble families. Military attachés bored with their assignments, acolytes who failed their trials but still remembered what they had seen. They weren't soldiers or warriors. They were keys. Each one opened something, and each one believed they had discovered Vowrawn, instead of the other way around. He was careful never to ask for favors. He gave them, quietly, without cost. 1 week it was access to restricted records. Another, a forgotten debt erased. A rival removed. A punishment delayed. He intervened rarely and always indirectly. But the message was clear. Proximity to Vowrawn made your life easier, more stable, more predictable. That was all most Sith wanted, not greatness, but safety from each other. In an empire built on betrayal, stability was the rarest luxury. He understood who to touch, and when. A word at the right gala, a glance during a trial, a subtle nod when a senator hesitated in speech. He became a fixture at events, always in the corner of the room, never center stage, always watching, always remembering. By the time his influence reached the central court of Cast City, most assumed he had inherited the network from his master. Few remembered Iridios, fewer still questioned the transition, and Vowrawn encouraged it. He never corrected those who spoke of him as a caretaker, not an architect, because caretakers are not threats. They're invisible, essential, overlooked. The turning point came during the Arcanian trade crisis. A syndicate of fringe Sith attempted to monopolize biotech research along the Mid-Rim, creating an alliance of corporations and dark side loyalists that threatened to fracture the already unstable economic web supporting the Empire. The Council debated. Some pushed for military strikes. Others argued for assassinations. Weeks passed. Vowrawn listened. He drafted a false accord, an agreement written in the name of the syndicate's leaders, one that promised cooperation with the Jedi for mutual benefit. The document was never sent, never shown. It simply appeared once, on a restricted server used by Intelligence Division 6. Within hours, the Dark Council voted for annihilation. The syndicate was wiped out. The companies dissolved. Their holdings absorbed not by the military, not by the council, but by shell entities quietly linked to Vowrawn's personal holdings. All legal, all silent, and yet no one could accuse him, because no one could prove it was his idea. They only saw a lord who stayed calm during chaos, a lord who never sought vengeance, only order. The galaxy was still cracking. Wars with the Republic, rumors of the Eternal Empire, shifts in Jedi doctrine, and through it all, Vowrawn moved without resistance. While others fought over blood, he followed connections, patterns, people. He didn't win battles. He removed reasons to fight. He didn't lead fleets. He decided where they stalled. One Sith called him a spider with velvet legs. Another whispered that Vowrawn had no enemies, only mistakes waiting to be forgiven. They weren't wrong, but they didn't understand. Vowrawn wasn't building an empire. He was becoming one. He never built a temple, never trained disciples, never claimed a domain. And yet, Darth Vowrawn shaped more Sith than most would ever realize. Not by teaching, but by allowing others to learn the wrong lessons. He made mistakes look like triumph. He made failures look like design. And in doing so, he turned silence into doctrine. Young Sith began copying his speech, calm, subtle, almost soothing. They mimicked his movements, the way he folded his hands behind his back, the way he tilted his head in conversation, as if always weighing truth against advantage. No one told them to. They simply noticed that lords who echoed Vowrawn's style lived longer, climbed faster, bled less. He gave no orders. He published no writings. But influence spread like shadow at dusk, inevitable, quiet, irreversible. He spent time where others wouldn't, listening to civil architects argue over taxation law, speaking with supply chain officials about fuel rationing routes, observing apprentices train while their masters watched elsewhere. It was there, in the forgotten corners of power, that he wrote his lessons. He watched how the Empire maintained itself, not through battle, but through bureaucracy, not through passion, but process. And where others saw boredom, he saw leverage. He altered nothing at first, just small changes, a redirected fund, a new oversight post, an ambiguous edit to language in an ancient treaty, things too small for attention, too precise for complaint. but the effects built like pressure beneath stone. Decisions became easier when Vowrawn was consulted. Problems disappeared faster when he was informed. And soon, people stopped asking why. They simply assumed he had always been part of the answer. Even the Sith Council, known for its paranoia and tradition, began to shift. Vowrawn didn't challenge the strong. He replaced the weak. Lords who resisted him weren't targeted, they were forgotten. Passed over, outvoted, their influence fading not in blood, but in silence. And they never saw the moment they became irrelevant. Only that Vowrawn had already replaced their seat before they realized it was empty. It was during this time that an old, blind archivist approached him after a council briefing. "You never speak unless you've already won," the woman said softly. Vowrawn offered only a nod. "And you never lie," she added. "But the truth you tell is shaped like a blade." He smiled and said nothing, because the archivist was right. The truth was always his sharpest weapon. One truth: the Sith valued chaos, but feared instability. Another: the strongest lords burned brightest and shortest. And one more: everyone, even Sith, wanted to believe they had a choice even as their path narrowed with every whisper Vowrawn left behind. He didn't control the Empire. He made the Empire believe it controlled itself. There were those who began to suspect. A few who saw the shape of what he was building, not an empire of war, but an empire of habit, where orders no longer needed to be given, where decisions became reflex. One lord tried to expose him. A formal challenge, a speech before the council about corruption, about quiet takeovers, about rot hidden behind smiles. Vowrawn responded with a question. "Do you feel unsafe?" he asked gently. The chamber fell silent. The Lord said nothing, because the answer was no. And in the Empire, safety was the last illusion before power changed hands. Vowrawn never claimed victory that day. But when the council reconvened the next cycle, that seat was empty. He didn't replace it. He just adjusted the seating chart. The Dark Council was not a seat of leadership. It was a stage for execution. A dozen thrones arranged in a circle, each filled by a monster cloaked in ceremony and silence. They called it governance. But no laws were passed here, only verdicts. And Vowrawn stepped into it, smiling. His ascension was subtle, a quiet vote, an uncontested appointment, the kind that didn't draw celebration or resistance. Only a nod from one counselor, a shrug from another. His rivals hadn't realized they'd lost until they saw him seated. And by then, it was too late. The chamber was high above Kars City, a place where the wind carried whispers but never answers. Every counselor had their own domain, their own secrets, their own armies and economies folded beneath layers of forged documents and forgotten bloodlines. But inside that chamber, they were equals, by title, not by power. Vowrawn understood this instantly. They did not argue, they performed. Every gesture mattered, every pause. Counselor Mortis once took 7 full seconds to respond to a question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because silence made his enemies question themselves. Darth Ravage corrected others not with evidence, but with tone. Darth Maul rarely spoke at all, but when he did, no one interrupted. There were no allies, only rhythms, and Vowrawn danced through them. He did not challenge, he echoed. When Ma spoke of war, Vowrawn complimented his clarity. When Mortis hinted at dissent, Vowrawn nodded with quiet understanding. When Ravage snapped, Vowrawn offered peace. Not out of fear, but because predators relax around sheep. And Vowrawn wore the wool well. His power was not in votes. It was in memory. He learned the shape of every rivalry, the code beneath every phrase, the way Sith with 1,000 planets under their control still flinched when the Emperor's name was spoken. And that name Vitiate ruled over them all. He did not appear, not in person, not in holocron. Only his voice ever entered the chamber, a vessel filled with power too immense to question and too empty to understand. When the voice spoke, everyone listened. Even Mar lowered his head, but not Vowrawn. He kept his head bowed, his eyes closed. But he listened beyond the words. The voice was not a man. It was an echo, a thing that spoke with too much confidence, too little care. It did not argue. It instructed. And Vowrawn knew this was not leadership. This was puppetry. In that moment, he began to see what others refused to admit. The council did not serve the Emperor. It shielded him. Every decree passed down was shaped to protect his silence. Every death sanctioned was done to defend his image. The Sith Empire was not ruled by strength. It was held hostage by worship. Vowrawn didn't hate the Emperor for it. He simply saw the flaw in the foundation. And flaws were opportunities. He said nothing. He made no move. But in the quiet corners of his estate, he began shifting resources. He consolidated old alliances. He reopened files from Iridios's time, searching for patterns. Not to expose the Emperor, that would be suicide, but to understand the limits of his reach. The council called it loyalty. Vowrawn called it research. He spent months in that chamber, listening, watching, waiting. He saw Darth Vengin fall, betrayed by Darth Vowrawn. He watched the balance of power shift not through war, but whispers. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And Vowrawn learned every step. They thought him harmless, a politician, a diplomat in red robes. They were half right. He wasn't harmless. He was patient. And in the Emperor's court of lies, patience was the only truth left. There was a chair no one sat in. At the center of the council, raised slightly above the others, carved from stone darker than obsidian, lined with ancient etchings none could translate, the Emperor's throne. It had been empty for centuries. The voice stood in its shadow, but never upon it. That space was sacred not to the Sith, but to the myth they served. To speak of it was forbidden. To question it was treason. And so, the council carried on, beneath a throne without a master, obeying a silence that stretched through time like a blade across the galaxy's throat. Vowrawn never approached it, but he studied its weight. There were moments when the council paused not in disagreement, but in waiting. Waiting for guidance that never came. Waiting for a god that no longer answered. And in those gaps, Vowrawn saw a truth even Mar would not speak aloud. The Emperor was gone. Not in body, not in title, but in purpose. He had retreated deep into the shadows of the galaxy, consumed by rituals too vast for the council to understand. His will remained, transmitted through agents, voices, visions, but his presence had dimmed, and Vowrawn felt the difference. The Force had rhythm, and where once the Emperor's presence pressed against everything like a constant drumbeat, now there was only the fading hum of what had been. Others clung harder. Mortis began invoking the Emperor in every vote. Vowrawn expanded intelligence operations in his name. Darth Hadra obsessed over constructing monuments that no one visited. Even Darth Rictus, mad with age, began meditating in silence for days, waiting for a word that never came. But Vowrawn did not wait. He listened, and the silence spoke. It spoke in lost fleets, in failed rituals, in planets abandoned without explanation. It spoke in the way fear had begun to mutate, no longer the fear of betrayal, but the fear of irrelevance. Without the Emperor, what were they? What was the purpose of the Sith Empire if its God no longer cared to rule it? Vowrawn did not ask this out loud. He asked it in motion. He restructured supply chains, redirected funding from religious preservation to internal development. When questioned, he praised the Emperor's foresight, suggesting, softly, that the Empire's strength was best shown by its ability to grow without constant supervision. Some agreed, most remained silent. But silence, in the court of lies, was always permission. The voice came less frequently. When it did, its messages were shorter, colder, more disconnected. Entire star systems were ordered to be purged without cause. Jedi temples were ignored while Sith temples were evacuated. And when Vowrawn traced the orders back, he found no logic, no strategy, only hunger. The Emperor was not guiding them anymore. He was feeding, draining worlds, tearing life from planets without warning. No political goal, no military necessity, just hunger given shape. And still, the council bowed. Vowrawn did too, but only in public. In private, he prepared, not to destroy the Emperor, that would be impossible, but to outlive him, to ensure that when the throne finally crumbled, someone was already standing behind it. He didn't need to rule. He just needed to remain. The others fought for power, for recognition, for validation from a ruler who had already abandoned them. But Vowrawn understood. There was no future in worshipping a dying god, only in replacing the fear he left behind. And while the others clung to the illusion of control, Vowrawn wrote the truth in silence. The Sith Code taught that peace was a lie, but inside the Dark Council, it was a requirement. Not true peace, not agreement, but balance, a stillness maintained through ritual, hierarchy, and unspoken rules. 12 lords, each ruling their domain, pretending to be equal, each watching the others for signs of weakness, each waiting to strike. And eventually, they did. The cracks began with Darth Vowrawn. He had grown too bold. As the head of Imperial intelligence, Vowrawn believed he could shape the future by controlling what the Council heard. He replaced facts with whispers, shifted threats, manufactured victories. And when no one stopped him, he began claiming authority beyond his sphere, declaring himself the voice of the Emperor. Vowrawn watched from the side of the chamber. He did not challenge Vowrawn. He congratulated him, praised his efficiency, referred to him as visionary. And in private, he let others carry the weight of opposition. Darth Maul confronted him in the field. Darth Thanaton began building his own networks. Darth Ravage fumed. Vowrawn believed he had divided the council, but he had only fed its hunger, and it devoured him, not through rebellion, but exposure. The moment Vowrawn claimed to be the Emperor's voice, the real voice returned just once and denounced him. It was enough. The council didn't execute Vowrawn. He vanished. The message was clear. No one spoke for the Emperor, because the Emperor no longer spoke. That was the first fall. It would not be the last. Thanaton challenged Darth Nox, a powerful Sith who had risen from slavery to power through sheer will and a mysterious connection to ancient Force spirits. Their duel tore through tradition, with Nox killing Thanaton in open combat inside the council chamber itself. It was unprecedented, it was illegal, and no one stopped it. Vowrawn didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, as if the room had finally caught up to what he already knew. There were no rules anymore, only survival. The chamber changed after that. more silence, more empty chairs. Councils held with 9, then 8, then 7 lords present. Some dead, some missing, some simply no longer trusted to attend in person. Vowrawn kept coming. He never raised his voice, never dueled, but his influence deepened. Every vote passed with his approval. Every agenda reflected his calculations. And still, he kept smiling. He understood what others did not. The council wasn't collapsing. It was being refined. The loud were removed, the proud eliminated. What remained were those too cautious to strike or too clever to be struck. And Vowrawn was both. He did not move pieces. He became the board. A fixed point others had to acknowledge to survive. His voice became the standard by which arguments were measured. His silences became decisions, and slowly, over years of blood and vanishing names, the council transformed, not into something purer, not into something stronger, but into something smaller, less a ruling body, more a ritual. 12 seats still stood, but only 5 were regularly filled, and the throne at the center remained empty. No one ruled, no one led. They only waited for the Emperor, for his return, for some signal that their obedience still mattered. But Vowrawn didn't wait. He moved, quietly, without announcement, one connection at a time, one system at a time, shaping the Empire in ways no one could trace, and no one dared oppose. Because the Council had done what all Sith feared most. It had consumed itself, and left him standing in the ashes. No one remembered when Vowrawn became the center of the Council. There was no proclamation, no elevation, just the slow realization that every decision passed through him. Every crisis paused for his opinion. Every rival, no matter how powerful, adjusted their tone in his presence. He never asked for it. He simply expected it. By now, Vowrawn had spent decades on the Dark Council. Others had come and gone, killed, exiled, consumed by power, or burned out by their own ambition. But he remained, not because he was the strongest or the most feared, but because he made it easy to forget he was dangerous. That was the secret. He let others win. He let Ravage storm through meetings with arrogance, let Mortis ramble about law and order. He let Nox posture in silence, cloaked in ancient power. He let Darth Maul speak for the military, knowing Maul was the only one who saw clearly. Vowrawn didn't argue. He adjusted. His influence didn't feel like control. It felt like gravity, not seen, but always there, pulling every decision toward equilibrium. His equilibrium. Behind closed doors, he began crafting alliances that bypassed the council altogether. Governors, economists, fleet commanders, civil overseers. They answered to others, but they looked to Vowrawn. Not out of loyalty, out of relief. He brought structure to chaos, sanity to madness, and for a Sith Empire fraying under the weight of centuries of war, that was enough. He still kept his estate modest for a Sith Lord. No grand towers, no colosseums, just quiet halls, filled with light and silence. And every visitor left with the same impression. A man who could speak for hours without ever revealing a single truth. There were rumors that Vowrawn had the Emperor's ear, that he had become the voice, that he was preparing something vast, a shift in the nature of Sith rule. But there was no evidence, only patterns, and the patterns pointed nowhere, because Vowrawn never left fingerprints, only consequences. When Darth Maul finally confronted him, not with accusation, but with curiosity, Vowrawn only smiled. "You see what I allow you to see," he said softly. "And yet, you see more than most." Ma nodded once and left without another word. That was the nature of power at the end of the old era. Not a throne, not a blade, but a smile. The Emperor's presence was nearly gone now. His rituals had taken him elsewhere across the stars, into silence, into death. Only fragments remained, echoes, a shadow of hunger moving through systems like a wound in the Force. The council still met, but not out of purpose, out of habit. They spoke, but their words had no weight. They ruled, but nothing changed. The center had collapsed, the throne was dust, and in its absence, Vowrawn waited, not with desire, not with anger, with stillness. He knew what was coming. He had watched the signs for years, the movements in the unknown regions, the eternal empire stirring, the Jedi reorganizing in whispers. A new age was coming, not shaped by gods, but by survivors. He didn't want to be emperor. He just didn't want anyone else to be. Because true power was not taken. It was given when fear met comfort, when chaos met calm. And no one offered calm like Vowrawn. The Sith feared the light. The Jedi feared the dark. But everyone feared uncertainty. And that was the space where he waited, where he smiled, not behind the throne, but beneath it, where no one looked, until it was far too late. The war that consumed the stars never touched Vowrawn. It passed over his head like a storm, refusing to notice the quiet man beneath it. Armies moved, fleets burned, planets fell, but he remained still, not because he was afraid, because he was watching. The great galactic war had shattered what little balance the Sith Empire still pretended to hold. While Darth Vowrawn led fleets into the core and Darth Vowrawn hunted Jedi across space, the Dark Council fractured into a dozen competing agendas. Each lord believed the time had come to prove supremacy. Every battle was personal, every command a statement. But Vowrawn gave no orders. He issued no declarations. He didn't rush to the front. He didn't claim territory. He sent no apprentices. He didn't need to, because Vowrawn understood what others forgot. War is loud. And while the galaxy listened to its thunder, no one heard the silence behind it. That was where he lived. He let the others fight. Let them soak the galaxy in fire and blood, because every time a lord moved forward, they left something behind. A supply chain, a bank, a family, an old ally now ignored. These weren't targets. They were fractures, and Vowrawn moved through them like air. He didn't destroy fleets. He dismantled the systems that kept them afloat, a bribe to a logistics chief, a forged communique rerouting fuel cells. A whispered rumor about a governor's loyalty passed to the right officer at the wrong moment. Ships stalled. Orders didn't arrive. Sectors fell quiet. And no one blamed him. He sent gifts to the widows of Sith Lords who died in battle, flowers to the families of fallen officers. He praised every victory, mourned every loss. His name appeared on every condolence record, every financial ledger, every report of sympathy. It was kindness, they thought. But Vowrawn was not kind. He was present, and presence in wartime becomes memory. Memory becomes trust. Trust becomes leverage. He didn't need spies. People told him things for free, because he remembered birthdays, because he knew their names, because while their lords screamed in fury across the stars, Vowrawn whispered peace to those left behind. He visited worlds no counselor cared for, outposts, manufacturing moons, communications hubs. He arrived unannounced, walked with governors, asked about their families, spoke with local Sith, not of conquest, but of endurance. And they remembered. When supply lines broke, it was Vowrawn's networks that stepped in. When command chains failed, it was Vowrawn's people who ensured the system stayed stable, quiet, predictable. Some called him a coward, a shadow, a politician hiding while others fought and died. But then those lords began to vanish. First was Darth Vowrawn, whose fleet starved in orbit after supply reroutes left him stranded. Then Darth Vowrawn, whose fortress was bombed by a resistance group funded by someone she had once dismissed in Vowrawn's presence. Then Darth Severick, assassinated by his own bodyguard after a single private meeting with the red-robed counselor from Kars. No proof, no pattern, only absence. And always, Vowrawn smiled. He sent condolences, spoke at their memorials, promoted their surviving aides. He never replaced them, never took their seats. But he never had to. Because Vowrawn didn't win the war, he waited for it to pass. And when the smoke began to fade, he was the only one still standing with clean hands. No one ever heard Vowrawn raise his voice. Not in victory, not in fear. Not even when the council chamber shook from planetary losses or the deaths of its own members. He simply laughed soft, warm, measured, and that terrified them more than any scream ever could. His laughter wasn't joy, it wasn't madness, it was control, a tool sharpened finer than any vibroblade. In the presence of fury, he laughed gently. In the face of accusation, he chuckled with grace. Even when warned of assassination, he offered a sighing smile as if to say, "How tiresome." Because for Vowrawn, nothing was ever urgent. Everything had already been planned. His enemies believed they were circling a man too distracted to see their knives, but Vowrawn was always circling them. In courtrooms, in war rooms, in social gatherings meant for senators and Sith nobility. He never spoke of power, never spoke of the war. He asked about the health of a mother, the safety of a cousin, the fate of a former servant. And in those questions, the blade was hidden. Because each kindness opened a door, each door led to a secret. And secrets in the Empire were never free. He didn't demand anything in return, not at first. But months later, when a shipment needed to be misplaced, or a report delayed, they remembered the man who had remembered them. And they complied. He wore robes of deep red ceremonial, perfectly cut, but never ostentatious. He walked like a man without enemies, because those who thought they were his enemies were already being dismantled from within. He didn't kill, he let others fall. One by one, rivals lost access to funds, to ships, to people, not by attack, but by erosion. Quiet resignations, unexpected reassignments, failing health, bureaucratic confusion. They lost their footing before they ever felt the push. And then, they simply vanished. Sometimes, their deaths made the Outlived. A transport explosion, a duel gone wrong, a tragic illness. Sometimes, there was no announcement at all, just silence, and Vowrawn never acknowledged them, never claimed responsibility. He only laughed when others brought their names up. Darth Vowrawn once accused him openly, called him a manipulator, a coward, a virus infecting the Empire from within. Vowrawn's reply was a single sentence: "You think too highly of yourself, old friend." The next week, Vowrawn was discovered to have falsified records related to an ancient Sith tomb, a violation so serious it warranted exile. Whether the records were real, no one could say. But Vowrawn quietly funded the expedition to preserve the tomb anyway. For history, he claimed. He never denied the betrayal. He never confirmed it either. That was the design. He didn't leave evidence. He left silence in his wake. The war raged on. Jedi fell. Republic worlds burned. But within the Empire, another war had already ended, one fought not with lightsabers, but with favors, with omissions, with carefully timed gestures that seemed too polite to be dangerous. And always, behind it all, his laughter. Because Vowrawn understood something the other Sith refused to accept. You didn't have to kill someone to destroy them. You only had to take away everything they thought made them powerful. And when it was all gone, when the mask cracked, and the throne shattered beneath them, he would still be standing, smiling, laughing, as if death itself were just another conversation politely avoided. Darth Vilius was not a fool. He had ruled 3 sectors, commanded a private navy, and crushed uprisings without ever setting foot on the ground. His name was feared, his temper legendary, and for years he had dismissed Vowrawn as a non-threat, a politician with too much perfume and not enough scars. But Vowrawn remembered every insult. He kept them folded neatly, like notes in an archive, not because he was angry, but because he knew time would come collect on them. And when it did, there would be no need for vengeance, only removal. It began quietly, a contract dispute on Vilius's key supply world, then a delay in munitions, a reshuffling of diplomatic permissions. Each incident excused by bureaucracy, defended by procedure, hidden beneath layers of plausible deniability. And Vilius, loud, proud, brutal, did what all Sith trained in war did. He roared. He sent threats, filed grievances, demanded an audience before the council. And when that failed, he arrived in person, red-eyed, furious, flanked by guards, shouting across the chamber floor. Vowrawn didn't respond. He simply turned his head, just slightly, and smiled. 3 days later, a surveillance leak exposed Vilius's personal slave network, illegal even by Imperial standards. His name was redacted from several high clearance lists. His access was downgraded, and when he summoned his fleets to assert control over the situation, they did not answer. They had been rerouted, not sabotaged, not stolen, just reassigned, quietly, without explanation, through old protocols Vilius had never bothered to review. He resigned a week later. Officially, he retreated to private meditation. Unofficially, no one spoke his name again. Vowrawn made no announcement. He issued no statement. But within hours, 2 of Vilius's former enforcers were promoted, one to the Ministry of Defense, the other to intelligence coordination. Both owed him favors. Both knew better than to say it aloud. This was how Vowrawn moved. Not through conquest, through vacancy. He didn't take territory. He waited for it to become available. And while the galaxy burned under lightsabers and star destroyers, he focused on a different battlefield memory. He began rewriting the past, not overtly, not with lies, but with emphasis. Records of old council meetings were re-indexed, names of fallen lords replaced with footnotes, victories reframed. It was Vowrawn's suggestion. He had warned of that outcome. He ensured the transition was smooth. No one questioned it, because no one wanted to be reminded of the chaos. The council needed continuity. Something to believe had always been there, and Vowrawn was happy to be that. Then came Darth Vowrawn, younger, brilliant, a rising star in Sith military doctrine, and one of the few who saw through the facade. He didn't accuse Vowrawn. He studied him, shadowed him, tried to learn how someone with no armies, no conquests, no temples could wield such power. And in doing so, he disappeared. Not in body, Vowrawn lived. But his influence eroded. His proposals were dismissed. His allies drifted. He wasn't removed. He was unmade. Because Vowrawn knew how to destroy without conflict, how to kill a reputation without touching the person. And once Vowrawn's name stopped appearing in minutes, in reports, in casual conversation, he was gone, not feared, not hated, just forgotten. And that was the final lesson. Not all Sith die with a scream. Some fade with a whisper. And those are the ones you should fear most. To most Sith, betrayal was violence. A sudden strike, a duel in a dark hole, a ship sabotaged, a blade ignited in the night. They believed treachery was strongest when it was loud, brutal, final. But Vowrawn understood something deeper. Betrayal was not an act. It was an atmosphere, a slow shift in pressure, a door that locked later than usual, a name removed from a list, a meeting someone wasn't invited to. Betrayal was time, not action. It was patience, not fury. He didn't betray people. He taught them to betray themselves. One of the clearest examples came during the Balmoran negotiations. The war effort had drained Imperial resources, and the Council sent Vowrawn as a neutral observer, a role he accepted with a polite bow and a silent laugh. He didn't negotiate. Others did. He simply watched. He watched Lord Maran speak too boldly, watched General Kren misjudge the Republic delegates, watched Governor Tharu attempt a backdoor deal. And then he nudged them, a suggestion placed at the wrong moment. A compliment that inflated a fragile ego. A false reassurance delivered with perfect sincerity. By the end of the week, the Sith delegation tore itself apart. Maran accused Kren. Kren blamed Tharu. Tharu fled the planet. Vowrawn wrote the final report himself. None of it mentioned him. He returned to the council with a smile and 3 new empty seats. Another moment came when Darth Vowrawn sought to expose him. Vowrawn had grown suspicious, convinced that Vowrawn's influence reached too far, too fast. He collected evidence, or what he believed was evidence, and prepared a grand accusation. Vowrawn let him. He even helped him. He provided Vowrawn with missing files, filled in gaps in his theory, and offered gentle encouragement. By the time Vowrawn stood before the council, he believed he had the truth. He only had what Vowrawn allowed him to see. His entire argument collapsed in minutes. His sources contradicted themselves. His claims were unsupported. And when the council demanded an explanation, Vowrawn realized too late that the one man he thought he had cornered was the only one who had stood beside him. Vowrawn resigned in shame. No one replaced him. Vowrawn didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled softly, as if pleased a storm had passed. To him, betrayal was not a strike. It was a reveal of who someone really was once the illusion broke. The galaxy continued its descent into chaos. Jedi scattered, Republic worlds trembled. Sith fleets stretched thin, tearing themselves apart in pursuit of glory. Yet in the middle of all this noise, Vowrawn's world remained quiet, predictable, controlled. Assassins were sent for him. He welcomed them, not with a duel, with a conversation. He walked them through his garden, asked about their families, offered them food, told them stories of ancient lords whose lives ended far too early. Some assassins returned home. Some simply switched sides. One even became a loyal informant until the day he died in an unrelated battle, a death Vowrawn personally honored with a private ceremony. He didn't kill his enemies. He made them irrelevant. That was the art, not the blade, not the poison, not the lie, but the gentle pressure placed so perfectly that collapse felt like choice. Years later, when the war finally slowed and the council regained a shred of stability, only a few lords realized the truth. Vowrawn had not survived the war. He had sculpted it, not for conquest, not for glory, but for the simple, elegant pleasure of shaping the galaxy through the smallest possible motions. Betrayal was a craft, and he was its artist. The Emperor had been gone for too long. His voice had faded, his orders came in echoes, his will passed through false avatars and empty gestures. And for a while, the Sith believed he was simply elsewhere conducting rituals, preparing some unseen design. But even they began to doubt. Even the council began to speak his name with less fear, more formality. And then, he returned, not in glory, not in ceremony, but in fire, in death. The rebirth of Vitiate came without warning. First on Dromund Kaas, not as a figure, but as a presence. Power surged through the ancient capital like a scream beneath the earth. Lightning cracked through skies that had long grown used to storms. Statues fell, temples shook. And for the first time in decades, even the most faithful of Sith paused. They felt it. Something was wrong, not returned, but unbound. Vowrawn was the first to speak plainly. "This is not resurrection," he said quietly. "This is hunger." But no one listened. The council fractured almost immediately. Darth Maul sought answers in war. Darth Ravage demanded control. Others searched for old texts, ancient prophecies, desperate to make sense of what they felt. They needed a narrative, an explanation. Vowrawn asked for none, because he understood. The Emperor had not died, not truly. He had fractured himself, torn his soul into countless shards, scattered across bodies, worlds, echoes. He was not a man, not even a god. He was consumption given voice. And now, he was coming back. SWTOR was the proof, the final silence, a world stripped of life in a single breath. Not by weapons, not by armies, but by one presence, one will. The Emperor landed, spoke nothing, and fed. Millions died. Their essence drawn into something no one could see, only feel. The Force cried out, and even the Jedi, light years away, trembled. But Vowrawn did not tremble. He remained on Dromund Kaas, seated in silence while the council tore itself apart. Some wanted to flee, others wanted to kneel. A few suggested exile, hiding the Empire from its own creator. But not him. He stayed still. Because while the others were reacting, Vowrawn was remembering. He recalled every moment of absence, every decision passed through silence, every inconsistency, every order that made no sense until now. It had never been rule. It had always been preparation. The Emperor was not leading. He was feeding, building something beyond understanding, a vessel of eternity. And now that he no longer needed the council, the empire, or the throne, he had returned to erase them. But Vowrawn had planned for this, not with blades, with patience. He had already built an empire beneath the empire, not in secret, but in plain sight. Systems that could function without orders. People loyal not to doctrine, but to outcomes. An infrastructure shaped by logic, not fear. And so, while others screamed, Vowrawn whispered, "Let him come." He watched the recordings of SWTOR in silence, studied the movement of the Force in real time. Not to stop it, that was impossible, but to trace it, to measure the depth of the abyss before it reached them. He knew then what no Sith dared admit. The Emperor could not be killed, only outlasted, and Vowrawn had made outlasting his art. The destruction of SWTOR did not send a message, It erased one. There were no survivors, no rebellions, no martyrs, only absence, as if the world had never been alive. The Republic condemned it. The Jedi meditated on it. The Sith whispered about it in hallways lined with shadows. But no one truly understood what had happened. Because SWTOR wasn't conquered. It was consumed, and the thing that had consumed it did not stay. The Emperor vanished again, not in defeat, in satisfaction, as if that world, that sacrifice, had been enough for now. And in his absence, the galaxy began to tremble not in battle, but in uncertainty. Fear without a face, dread without direction. The council met in emergency sessions. Half the seats were empty. Those who remained argued not about strategy, but belief. Was this truly vitiate? Was it a fragment? Was he now something else or something he had always been, now unmasked? Darth Maul grew quieter. He had once been the voice of purpose within chaos. Now, he looked to the stars as if waiting for them to vanish one by one. Darth Mortis argued for total lockdown. Darth Nox withdrew, searching for ways to bind death itself through rituals lost even to time. And Vowrawn said nothing, because he had already seen the shape of the new galaxy. And it was empty. The Emperor was no longer building an empire. He was building silence, a galaxy without Jedi. Without Sith, without memory, no war, no peace, just stillness where only his will remained. Others wanted to fight, to chase. Vowrawn waited. He sent no fleets, no assassins. He closed no gates. Instead, he widened them. Systems were told to remain calm. Supply lines were strengthened, not hidden. Temples were protected, not weaponized. And still, he prepared, because silence was coming. A silence that could devour everything if met with noise. He knew the Emperor fed on conflict, on death, on fear. And so Vowrawn offered him something else. Nothing. No provocation, no response. The other Sith didn't see the trap. They screamed into the dark and were heard. Jedi raiding parties vanished. Republic outposts went dark. Even some Sith Lords who tried to contact the voice were found dead. Their bodies untouched, their minds hollowed out. Vowrawn visited those chambers, alone. He stood over their corpses, not in horror but in calculation. "How deep does it reach?" he whispered once. Not to anyone, just to the Force. The answer never came. But he didn't need it. He already knew. The Emperor's reach was not measured in ships or armies anymore. It was measured in silence. Every voice extinguished gave him strength. Every absence left space for him to grow. And so Vowrawn did the one thing no Sith had ever done when faced with godhood. He knelt, but not to submit, to vanish. He erased himself from the data grid, removed his name from several communications networks, delegated command outward in layers, wrapped his influence in false titles and rotating proxies. If the Emperor sought minds to consume, he would find nothing in Vowrawn but reflections. And while others hunted shadows, Vowrawn shaped outcomes. Economies stabilized. Outer sectors held their order. Even dissent within the Empire began to settle not because of loyalty, but because there was no chaos to feed on. The Empire became calm, too calm, and in that stillness, the Emperor could not feed. He still returned, here and there. A whisper, a ripple, but never for long. Because silence was no longer his alone. When the Emperor vanished after SWTOR, the Sith Council fractured completely. Some believed he had ascended to a higher plane. Others whispered he was still watching from somewhere beyond the veil, judging their every word. A few dared to think he was truly gone. But Vowrawn never assumed, he planned. Because absence was not safety. It was exposure. Into that vacuum, a new presence emerged, not a deity, but a doctrine. The Eternal Empire, Zakul, a force wrapped in armor and mystery, bearing powers unseen even by the ancient Sith. They came not with fire, but with inevitability, and the Sith were unprepared. Worlds began to fall, hyperlanes collapsed, communications blacked out. Entire fleets were erased in seconds. It was not war, it was replacement. The empire that had survived centuries of infighting, betrayal, and rebellion now faced a power it could not comprehend. Darth Maul stepped forward first. He sought contact, understanding. He did not return. The council splintered further. Fear disguised itself as strategy. Rivalries reignited. Leadership dissolved into silence. Everyone searched for someone to follow, or someone to blame. And in that fog, Vowrawn remained seated. Not because he refused to act, because he already had. The systems he built held firm. Logistics ran without interruption. The chain of command, though fractured on the surface, held shape beneath layers of delegation. Sectors under Vowrawn's influence did not collapse, they adapted, and those watching began to see the truth. There was no emperor, there was no council, there was only structure, and Vowrawn was its architect. He did not claim the throne, he didn't need to. The throne was gone, taken by an enemy none could confront, stolen by a legacy none could match. But power didn't need to sit at the center. It only needed to be the thing everything else leaned toward. He became that. One governor called him the mask that still breathes. Another said, we listen to Vowrawn not because we trust him, but because nothing else makes sense. He wore the image well. In public, he remained quiet, ceremonial, composed. He attended funerals, spoke only when invited, congratulated his enemies, celebrated false victories, and in private, he decided. Trade routes reopened. Systems were abandoned strategically, not out of fear, but by his design. Resources were moved not to save planets, but to protect patterns. The illusion of order persisted, and within that illusion, the Sith still existed. But it wasn't the Empire that survived. It was Vowrawn's design. Every lord who opposed him found themselves isolated, not killed, not silenced, just disconnected from allies, from funds, from opportunity. They drifted until they disappeared, some by exile, some by failure, a few by their own hands. Because in a time when the galaxy needed a voice, Vowrawn became the mask. Not loud, not glorious, but constant. Even those outside the Sith hierarchy began to notice. Zakulan agents intercepted messages signed by his name. Republic diplomats encountered systems under his protection that still functioned without war. Jedi envoys, confused by the quiet, described a shadow leading something that no longer called itself a council-only order. But Vowrawn didn't call it anything. He simply allowed it to breathe. He did not stand above it. He stood behind it. And in that position, he was untouchable. Because the galaxy wasn't asking who ruled anymore. It was asking who remained. And behind every answer, behind every title still spoken with reverence, was him. The mask, the voice, the memory of structure when all else had been forgotten. He had lived under the Emperor's shadow his entire life, born into a galaxy shaped by vitiate's silence, raised in an order twisted by his will, ascended within a council that bowed to his absence. And now, As the galaxy faced extinction from forces no one could name, Vowrawn found himself where few Sith ever stood. Above the shadow, not in power, in patience, the Eternal Empire rose unchecked. Zakuul's fleets swept across both Sith and Republic space with no allegiance, no compromise, no mercy. Their technology was impossible, their strategy precise. Their leaders, Arkan, Valen, Senya, were enigmas cloaked in tragedy. But Vowrawn saw the pattern. They weren't invincible, they were inevitable. And inevitability, like all things, could be delayed. He did not challenge them. Others did and fell. He did not send fleets. Others did and vanished. He watched, waited, adjusted. Systems under his influence bent without breaking. Resources vanished before they could be seized. Local governors were encouraged to surrender only what they could afford to lose. He gave Zakuul nothing valuable, only surface, and in doing so, he preserved the spine. The Council, by now, was functionally dead. Darth Maul gone, Nox unresponsive, Ravage presumed executed. Only fragments remained lords who called themselves rulers in name alone. They debated nothing, passed no decrees, sat in quiet chambers like ghosts waiting for a war already lost. But not Vowrawn. He no longer attended council meetings. He no longer summoned allies. He had no need for stagecraft. His network stretched across systems, tied together by years of invisible planning. Trade still flowed. Orders were still followed. Not because of fear, but because no one else remained to issue them. In the shadow of a god who could not die, Vowrawn became something rarer. A mind that refused to move. He understood the truth. Vitiate had not been defeated, only delayed. His essence lived on in Valkorion, in Arkan, in echoes spread across the stars. He was still feeding, still hiding, still shaping things unseen. But Vowrawn did not hunt him, because he knew the Emperor could not be destroyed by blades, only by time, and time had always been Vowrawn's weapon. He remained still when others rushed. He smiled when others shouted. He endured through the destruction of Ziost, through the fall of Drummond Kaas, through the reign of Zakuul. He became a legend not for what he conquered, but for what he refused to lose. The Sith Empire still had a heartbeat. It pulsed slowly now, deeper beneath the surface. But it lived, not in glory, not in fire, but in resilience. And every beat of that heart was his. The galaxy forgot the old names. Vitiate, Valkorion, Mar, Thanaton. But Vowrawn's name remained. Not shouted, whispered. He became a figure in the background of every solution. A signature at the bottom of every treaty. A voice consulted when no one else could offer reason. Not feared, not worshipped, trusted. And that was what the Emperor had never understood. Power rooted in fear was powerful, but fragile. Power rooted in trust was eternal. So Vowrawn waited, not to ascend, not to destroy, to outlast. When gods fall, the galaxy needs a memory of stability, a shape to return to, a name that never vanished. He never claimed victory. He never declared survival. He simply remained, calm, quiet, certain, patience in the shadow of a god. And when that shadow finally disappeared, Vowrawn would still be there. The Battle of Corellia was not just a war, it was a mirror. For centuries, the Sith had believed themselves eternal, a storm that could never pass. They wore blood like armor, burned worlds like incense, and ruled by fear alone. But on Corellia, the storm broke. It began with a rebellion. local resistance, Republic involvement, nothing new. Corellia had always been volatile, rich in industry, proud in identity, too useful to destroy and too independent to fully control. But when the Sith arrived in force, they expected submission. Instead, they found purpose. The Republic didn't retreat. They dug in. The resistance didn't fracture. It grew. The Jedi didn't scatter. They rallied. And while Darth Decimus took the battle head-on, deploying troops, sending reinforcements, crushing opposition in the streets, Vowrawn watched from a distance. He didn't arrive with a fleet. He came with a list. The Empire's leadership had grown bloated. Too many lords, too many titles, too many hands grasping at the same prize. The battle wasn't just about Corellia. It was about thinning the ranks, not through orders, but through outcome. Vowrawn knew who would die before the fighting started. He made sure they were there. Not with malice, with strategy. Lords who had questioned him, who had amassed power beyond their purpose, who had become obstacles to a future he had not yet spoken aloud. They were sent to support the front, secure influence, lead from strength. And one by one, they fell to Jedi blades, to Republic traps, to their own arrogance. He didn't need to betray them. He just didn't save them. And as Corellia burned, something else collapsed. The illusion of unity. The Sith Empire had never been united, but Corellia made the fracture visible. Rival lords refused to reinforce each other. Orders were ignored. Some commanders changed allegiances mid-battle to protect their assets. Entire units vanished from the field with no record of combat. Vowrawn documented everything. He recorded transmissions, logged inconsistencies, tracked absences, not for punishment, for reshaping. This was the moment the old order died, not with surrender, with exposure. And in that light, Vowrawn remained untouched. He met privately with neutral observers, with local leaders, with intelligence agents embedded too deeply to extract. He didn't issue commands, he asked questions. What happens after? Because Vowrawn didn't care who held the factories. He cared who remembered the Empire afterward. When the Council convened in the battle's aftermath, it was smaller, not just in numbers, in voice. No one spoke with confidence. No one declared victory. Some blamed Decimus. Others blamed Republic treachery. A few blamed the Jedi. But no one blamed Vowrawn. He praised the troops, mourned the dead, offered calm. But in private, he erased names. Old lords who had ruled for decades were quietly removed from records. Successors were confirmed in their place, most of whom owed their survival to his silence. Territories were reassigned, resources redirected. Command was no longer claimed. It was granted by him, through others, in layers so quiet no one noticed. Because Corellia hadn't just broken the front lines, it had cleared the board. And now, at last, Vowrawn could begin. Not with conquest, not with ceremony, but with the first step toward an empire that no longer needed fear to breathe. Only structure, only memory, and only one mind, quiet in the center, guiding it forward. Vowrawn never set foot on the Corellian front. Not once. But his presence was there in whispers, in orders not questioned, in decisions made by others who didn't know they were acting on his behalf. While blaster fire echoed through the factory sectors and ships burned in the upper atmosphere, he moved through the fire without being seen. Not by walking through it, by knowing exactly where not to stand. The galaxy remembered Darth Decimus. His face was on every holonet broadcast. His voice echoed in every command channel. His rage burned across every battlefield. But when he died, struck down during the final push to reclaim the government sector, nothing changed. There were no tremors, no power vacuum, because Vowrawn had already prepared the response. The troops received new orders instantly. Logistics continued. Regional command transitioned without interruption. Systems held. The war ended, but Vowrawn's structure did not. That was the difference. He didn't chase outcomes. He shaped reactions. The Sith Empire had spent centuries believing in spectacle, in duels, in grand declarations. But Corellia had shown him something new. The Empire no longer needed performers. It needed permanence. It needed architecture. So Vowrawn built in the dark. He reached out to officials not through threats, but through consistency. Supply officers who never missed a deadline. Civil administrators who found themselves funded, then promoted, then transferred to systems in need and stabilized them. When asked who was behind it, no one had an answer. Only a name, only a smile. He called them stabilizers. Never loyalists, never followers. These were people who understood what the Empire needed was not more victories, but fewer collapses. While the Republic and Sith resumed their skirmishes, while the Jedi debated peace talks, Vowrawn moved inward, through bureaucracy, through routine. He began to adjust the spine of the Empire systems, no longer designed to bend to power, but to outlast it. And all the while, he laughed, not loudly, not mockingly, just enough to remind others that he had already seen the next 5 steps. One by one, the other lords came to him. Some arrived, cloaked in arrogance, believing they could absorb his networks. Others came in humility, seeking guidance after their allies had fallen. All of them walked away changed, not because of what he gave them, but because of what he didn't. He offered no promises, no contracts, no blood oaths. Only this: keep your systems stable, keep your hands clean, and stay silent. It was not a command, it was a map, and it worked. Corellia had proven one thing: fear fades. Even Sith grow tired of fire. But order remains. If it's made strong enough, quiet enough. He stopped appearing at council functions. He stopped making public speeches. His robes changed darker, simpler. His movements slowed. He appeared older, weaker, disinterested. But every system that functioned carried his rhythm. And the Sith who noticed stayed quiet, because they understood something no war could teach. The most dangerous step isn't the first into fire. It's the one taken after the fire ends. When the world looks away, when the galaxy believes it's safe again, that's when true control begins. And Vowrawn had been waiting his entire life for that moment. The Sith believed in names, titles carved into stone, legacies etched in blood. Darth this, Darth that. Each name a monument to terror, to conquest, to death. But Corellia had changed something. Vowrawn saw it in their eyes. The names were no longer enough. Darth Decimus had ruled through might. Darth Aho had ruled through spectacle. Both had fallen. Others had disappeared, not slain, not overthrown, just erased. The war had swept their names from memory faster than any assassin ever could. And still, the Empire functioned. Vowrawn understood what that meant. Power no longer lived in names. It lived in systems. He stopped using his own title outside the council. In messages, he signed only as administrator. In meetings, he allowed others to introduce him however they wished. He gave no correction, no clarification. And yet, everyone listened when he spoke, not because of who he was, but because everything around him still worked. In the years following Corellia, The galaxy entered a strange quiet. The war cooled, the Republic restructured, the Jedi withdrew. And within the Empire, something colder began to take root. Sith Lords still claimed territories, still dueled, still postured. But their victories rang hollow, because behind every action, behind every decision, there was a shadow not dictating, not interrupting, just present. And that shadow bore no name. Lords began to avoid grand declarations. Those who drew attention found resources slow to arrive, communications delayed, support from neutral systems mysteriously retracted. Those who remained subtle were rewarded. No one could prove anything. No one accused Vowrawn, but they all felt the weight. The power behind the curtain, the hand behind the silence. Vowrawn was not building an empire of fear. He was removing its need for names at all. Every lord who stepped out of line was not eliminated, they were forgotten. Their replacements given the same robes, the same roles, but less ambition. More efficiency, less history, more silence. One by one, the stars began to settle. He dissolved 3 old ministries, not with fire but with integration. Their functions were absorbed by departments already functioning under his influence. No votes were held, no debates. The council barely noticed. Because the structure didn't collapse, it got faster. Even intelligence changed. Its networks realigned, reporting not through Sith channels but through administrative ones. Security briefings began using protocol numbers instead of names. Codename operations became numbers. Names became risks. The Sith, who had once carved their legacies into the bones of worlds, now operated in silence, not because they were afraid, but because the silence worked. That was the moment Vowrawn stopped ruling. He started vanishing. Not literally. He still appeared, still smiled, still spoke with senators and lords and envoys from broken sectors. But each year, he said less, delegated more, let others carry his tone, his style, his calm. And they did, because it worked. Soon, others stopped using names, too. Entire systems functioned without ever referencing who ruled them. Orders were followed not because of fear, but because no one remembered disobeying. Power, once a crown, was now a current, and Vowrawn was the tide. He had removed himself from history without leaving it. There were no statues, no hymns, no artifacts, only systems that refused to fail, because the names didn't matter anymore. Only the results. And the results still moved in his rhythm. There was no declaration. No day when Vowrawn stood before the Empire and said, "This is mine now." No ceremony, no lightsaber raised to the stars. Power didn't pass to him. It flowed. Like the dark itself, reshaped. Corellia had burned. The old order had shattered. But what emerged from its ruins wasn't a new throne. It was a new pattern, one shaped by rhythm, not rule. One that breathed through quiet corridors and unsigned orders. One that didn't need to be seen to be obeyed. That was the shape Vowrawn left behind. Not the kind of darkness the Sith were used to, not hatred, not chaos, not flame. This darkness was colder, more patient, a structure without face. A silence that hummed with order. The Sith didn't know what to call it, so they didn't. They just followed it. Not all at once, some resisted. A few still believed in the old ways, in titles, in declarations, in ancient codes scrawled into temple walls. But those voices grew quiet, not through death, but through design. Each time they acted out, they found themselves alone. Not opposed, just unsupported. And silence, in the Empire, was a death sentence of its own. Vowrawn understood that perfectly. Because for the first time in his long life, he had created something that did not need him. Systems continued without his oversight. Orders passed without his name. The Empire had become self-aware, and that was the plan. He began removing himself from the flow of things, not disappearing but loosening his grip, allowing governors to govern, allowing officers to lead. And in doing so, he tested his work not as a ruler, but as a craftsman tests the strength of a bridge. It didn't collapse. The Sith survived, not by flame, by framework. Even the Jedi didn't understand what had changed. They expected tyranny, expected another vitiate, another Mar, another name to place on the holonet, to rally against. But there was nothing, just an empire that did not die, because its shape had changed. And deep within that shape, behind walls that no longer needed guarding, in a room where silence had long become the rule, Vowrawn sat alone. Older, slower, but not broken. He watched stars shift, watched reports flow in, not for command, just for clarity. There were fewer surprises now, less urgency. Even war, when it returned, moved like theater, predictable, contained. He could have claimed more. He could have written his name into law, but he didn't. Because legacy didn't matter, only function. He had become something few Sith ever dared to be, the one who stopped reaching, and because of that, he became the one who lasted. Behind every rising lord, his rhythm still echoed. Behind every decision, his old design still held. His name faded, his presence softened, but his shape, the shape of the dark he had built, endured. The Empire no longer looked like fire. It looked like Vowrawn, measured, quiet, certain. A form of control so complete. It didn't need to control anything at all, just remain. And in that stillness, far from the days of war and screams and shattered thrones, a truth emerged. He had not survived Corellia. He had rewritten the very idea of survival. There was a moment when the galaxy no longer knew who ruled it. Not because peace had come, but because war had multiplied. The Sith Empire, the Republic, the Eternal Empire, the Alliance, names stacked on names, each claiming legitimacy, each collapsing behind the next. It was the war of all sides. And Vowrawn never picked one. He watched them emerge like waves over a battlefield he had already buried. The Eternal Empire rose in fire and gold, shattering fleets with impossible precision. Arkan's wrath swept across the galaxy like prophecy, and Valen's cruelty followed close behind. Whole sectors surrendered without a shot. Whole planets disappeared from maps without resistance. The Sith tried to rally. They failed. Darth Maul, once the final pillar of strength, chose diplomacy. He met Valkorion in person, hoping for answers, maybe even balance, but he never returned. Whether he was slain or absorbed, or simply lost in the Force, no one could say. His seat went dark. The council dissolved, not in defiance, in absence, and still, Vowrawn remained. He did not send fleets, he did not make demands, he listened. The Eternal Empire didn't operate like the Sith. It didn't consume for glory. It reorganized, efficient, cold, systemic. Zakuul's knights brought a strange order, a cleanliness to conquest that unsettled even the most hardened Sith. But Vowrawn had studied systems his entire life. He knew their rhythm. He knew how to survive inside one. So, he shifted. He made no speeches. But his envoys began appearing not in force, but in observation. He sent gifts. civil supplies, repair crews. He restored planetary data centers before the Eternal Empire could even ask. He wasn't submitting. He was proving his value. And they noticed. He met with Knight commanders in quiet spaces. He offered administrative insights, local cultural expectations, trade patterns. Each suggestion subtle, each one necessary. He offered nothing bold, nothing threatening, just stability. And in return, Zakuul left his systems alone. Not protected, not favored, just untouched. That was the goal. The galaxy was drowning in thrones. Arcan ruled, Valen killed. The Outlander rose. The Republic adapted. The Sith scattered. But Vowrawn stayed in motion not as a banner, but as a whisper. He survived inside the storm. Not as a blade, as a current. He let the others clash. Let them draw maps and erase them again. While armies moved, he moved paperwork. While rulers fell, he moved appointments. While cities burned, he positioned architects. And as the war expanded, Vowrawn shrank his presence. The name faded, the title blurred, but the effect grew. Everywhere the Eternal Empire expected collapse, there was order. Everywhere the Alliance expected chaos, there was silence. It was never dramatic, never perfect, just efficient. Enough to be noticed, enough to be left alone. And behind it, all the shape he had built long ago still held. His old rhythm, his quiet infrastructure, the hidden spine of an empire no longer calling itself anything at all. Because in a galaxy ruled by too many emperors, the only true power left was in the one who needed no crown. There was no seat left to sit on. Not in the council, not in the Senate, not on Zakuul's golden throne, now broken and bleeding under its own weight. Power moved too fast. Names changed too often. Titles meant less with every new regime that promised order and delivered only design. But Vowrawn never needed a throne. He only needed to be heard. Not by shouting, not by claiming, by whispering in the spaces others ignored. He became something different during the War of All Sides. Not a Sith Lord, not a rival to Valkorion's legacy, not a servant of the Alliance. He became a voice without allegiance, a thread of logic in a galaxy spinning toward madness. And it started, as it always had, with observation. The Eternal Empire fractured. Arcan's rage shattered systems. Valen's chaos poisoned the rest. The Outlander rose, fell, rose again. Zakuul itself wavered, wondering whether it had ever truly ruled anything at all. And through it, emissaries began to search for structure, not allies, not wars, just something that worked. They found him, not in palaces, in ledgers, in restored archives, in systems that hadn't collapsed, in regions where population reports still updated on time, where trade convoys arrived when expected, where power never flickered and fear had nowhere to settle. He received visitors, but never in the same place. Sometimes in a garden, sometimes in a transit hub, once in the ruins of a Sith temple, now repurposed into a data exchange. They asked how he had done it. He never answered directly. "I listened," he would say. Or, "Systems prefer predictability." Or, more often, "I stayed out of the way." But they understood the real answer. He had never left, never died, never ruled too loudly. He had been the constant. The middle of a spiral that everyone else had forgotten was still spinning. He didn't sell information. He didn't make demands. He simply advised. He advised Eternal Empire loyalists who no longer believed. He advised Republic commanders who no longer trusted their superiors. He advised Sith Lords who still wore the red but had long since abandoned the code. And he said the same thing to all of them. Choose what you can maintain, because power didn't matter anymore, only function. The galaxy had tried everything: prophecy, revenge, purity, democracy, peace, vengeance. Each had burned through the stars like a flare, but none had remained. Vowrawn didn't promise anything, but everything he touched still stood. It was not seduction, it was momentum. And so, he became the voice between thrones. The message passed in meetings where no one knew who authorized the meeting. The tip whispered before a raid failed. The suggestion added at the end of a council note that no one remembered writing. He didn't give commands. He gave context. And in return, the galaxy adapted. Not to him, to the rhythm. He wasn't rebuilding the empire. He was shaping what would come after. Not as an heir, as a placeholder, a neutral zone, a logic that could not be ruled because it had never claimed rule to begin with. In a galaxy filled with broken crowns and shattered temples, he was the only one who never fell, because he had never risen. The Sith once feared losing control. The Republic feared falling to tyranny. Zakuul feared nothing until it began to fear itself. And the Alliance, built to resist all of them, quietly fractured from the inside. No side was immune, because no side had clarity. The war blurred the lines between cause and survival. Lords pledged themselves to pragmatism. Jedi chose silence over action. Officers abandoned flags in favor of routine. Power had become a shape, not a symbol. And in that blurred galaxy, Vowrawn thrived. He was no longer the architect, not the hand behind the curtain. He had become the puppet, but one without strings. They asked him to lead. He declined. They asked him to command. He demurred. He smiled through it all, softly, calmly, like someone who already knew the offer itself was proof of his victory. Because true power was not in claiming the stage, it was in being asked to step on it. And still, he refused. Because once you are seen as irreplaceable, you stop being safe. Instead, Vowrawn allowed others to stand in his shadow. One administrator took credit for a successful realignment of border sector shipping lanes. Another claimed responsibility for re-establishing pre-war medical corridors. Neither had authored the plans. Both had used his strategies. Vowrawn said nothing. He let them rise, let them believe. And then, when the time came, he moved them sideways, upward, or into silence depending on how they reacted to success. That was how he measured people now. Not by what they gained, but by how they behaved after gaining it. Because Vowrawn didn't need loyalty anymore. He needed consistency. He had become something the others couldn't predict. Not a rival, not a ruler, not a prophet. Just there, always reasonable. Always in the right place at the right time, saying the exact thing that needed to be heard. And so, no one questioned when systems followed his guidance, because they didn't know they were following anything at all. He became an idea, a set of patterns, a whisper that justified change by referencing logic, not legacy. He asked for nothing in return, and in doing so, became indispensable. Even the Alliance, built on rebellion and fire, began to resemble him. Their leaders adopted his methods, decentralized control, prioritized stability over victory, redistributed power to those who asked for it least, not because they understood what he was doing, but because it worked. He wasn't a Sith Lord anymore. He wasn't anything. He was a movement too soft to name, too useful to resist, too calm to be destroyed. And in that stillness, the last puppeteers grew frustrated. Some tried to manipulate him. He let them try. Some tried to expose him. He provided them the evidence himself. Some tried to replace him, but no one noticed the replacements. Because by then, it was too late. There was no him to replace. Just a rhythm that had infected the structure of power itself. The Jedi spoke of balance. The Sith spoke of domination. Zakuul spoke of order. But Vowrawn had become something else entirely. A ghost in every system. A logic in every council. A silence that whispered without origin or end. And the galaxy followed. Not because they understood him, but because they no longer knew how to function without him. By the time the war slowed, the galaxy had already changed. Not through treaties, not through thrones, through exhaustion. Every side had taken losses it could no longer count. Systems were broken, faith was fractured. The Force, once a guiding presence, now felt quiet, unsure. But amid the silence, one name kept surfacing. Never shouted, only whispered, Vowrawn. Not as a leader, as a rumor. No one could say where he lived, whether he still held a council seat, whether he even identified as Sith anymore. Some said he had vanished. Others said he had ascended beyond titles. Most believed he had died years ago. And yet, his influence never faded. Peace conferences used protocols he authored. Neutral zones followed his economic models. Entire worlds claimed to have once received advice from him, though no records confirmed it. He became folklore, not mythic like Revan, not prophetic like Vitiate, but persistent. The whisper that systems could run without war, that order didn't need to roar, that survival was possible, if pride was not mistaken for necessity. Old Sith temples reopened not as sanctuaries of dominance, but as archives of administration. Republic officers quoted lessons attributed to him, even when denying they'd ever met him. Alliance commanders structured chains of command with redundancies modeled after his designs. And still, he was nowhere to be seen. Because the truth was simple. Vowrawn had never wanted to be remembered, only useful. In the decades that followed, the war became history, and that history, like all history, was distorted. Victories were claimed by those who arrived late. Sacrifices were praised that had never happened. The dead were sanctified. The cruel were softened. But Vowrawn remained undefined. There was no statue, no tomb, no recorded death. Just a pattern of calm that refused to die, even when its architect had long since stepped away. Some believed he still sent messages. Short ones, clean, always unsigned. Shift focus to energy distribution. Remove your name from the announcement. Do not escalate. Let it pass. Others said the messages were simply the system learning to correct itself. That Vowrawn's greatest work had not been what he ruled, but what he left behind. A structure without an ego. A current without a name. And yet, deep in the records of one outer rim station, long forgotten by the central databases, there is a note, not official, just handwritten, preserved by a junior analyst, too sentimental to delete it. It says, "The system will hold. He always said it would. Even if he doesn't return, there is no name attached. But they all know who it means. Because in a galaxy rebuilt from the bones of collapsed empires, there are no monuments to Vowrawn, only rhythm. And in that rhythm, the stars breathe a little easier. The people sleep a little longer. The power flows a little quieter. He was never crowned. He was never overthrown. He was never celebrated. But every government that rose afterward carried a trace of him. A rumor, a habit, a voice, soft, steady, measured. And in the end, it wasn't war that reshaped the galaxy. It wasn't prophecy. It wasn't hope. It was a man who listened longer than anyone else and left behind something no one could destroy. Structure. The death of Vitiate didn't echo across the galaxy. It collapsed in on itself, not with ceremony, not with defiance. It ended like a shadow, leaving a room, a presence once mistaken for eternity, now gone without explanation. The man who had ruled for over 1,000 years through flesh, through silence, through fear, simply disappeared. And for a moment, the galaxy exhaled. But the breath was too deep, too long, and in that silence, power shifted. The eternal empire shattered. Zakul crumbled into memory. The alliance, without direction, fractured into cells. And the Sith were quiet. Too much had broken. The Dark Council no longer functioned. Half its members were dead, vanished, or scattered. The remaining lords were cautious, withdrawn, watching the stars as if waiting for a voice to speak from them again. But the voice did not return. And so, they began to whisper. Not about war, not about the Force, about succession. Who would lead? Who could? The titles still existed: Emperor, Dark Lord, Supreme Commander. But none of them had weight anymore. Not in a galaxy that had seen what emperors truly were: monsters hidden behind ritual, feeding on systems until only silence remained. No one wanted that again. Except one. He did not declare himself. He didn't demand obedience. He didn't stand above the others. He sat, quietly, at the edge of the table, listening. Darth Vowrawn. He had survived every storm. Never the strongest, never the loudest, but always there, always steady, always smiling, even when everything else burned. And now, nothing stood in his way. But he didn't take the throne. He waited for it to be offered. At first, it was suggestion. Perhaps Vowrawn can arbitrate. He's always had a steady hand. No one else is suited for transition. Then, it became expectation. His name attached to documents without protest. His word used as the standard. His presence requested in every council meeting, every crisis summit, every planetary decision. And then, it became consent. Not in ceremony, in silence. He began signing orders, overseeing appointments, coordinating defense movements. Not because he demanded it, but because no one else did. No titles were stripped from others. No banners were raised. But every voice lowered when he entered the room. Not out of fear, out of recognition. He had become the center. Not by ascending, by remaining. The first time someone called him Emperor, it wasn't dramatic. It was a slip spoken by a foreign envoy, quickly corrected. But no one else corrected it. Vowrawn only smiled. And so it stayed. Not a crown. A quiet agreement. The Sith had finally accepted what Vowrawn had always known. Rage burns fast. Fear grows brittle. But presence lasts. He ruled not as a storm, but as gravity. No battles, no victories, no enemies slain. And yet, within weeks, the fragmented Sith territories began to move in harmony again. Trade resumed, communication stabilized. The chain of command began to rebuild not from old structures, but from his design. The throne had been empty for too long, and the galaxy had grown used to emptiness. So when Vowrawn filled it gently, slowly, they barely noticed. Because he never sat on the throne, he became it. No one feared him. Not in the way they had feared Vitiate. Not in the way Darth Malgus demanded fear with every breath, or how Barra sculpted it through deception. Vowrawn inspired something else. Reliability. He didn't wear ornate robes. He didn't build monuments. His throne room, if it could be called that, was a wide, circular space of muted colors, open light, and silence. No guards lined its edges. No torches flickered. Just one chair, and the man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. And when he smiled, the room stilled. Because by now, the galaxy understood what that smile meant. It meant he already knew. He didn't govern with declarations. He ruled by suggestion. If Vowrawn asked a question twice, the matter was already considered resolved. If he paused mid-sentence, advisors rewrote their notes. If he nodded at a name, that name returned with a title attached. And still, he smiled. Not out of arrogance, out of precision. He never punished publicly. That was beneath him. But lords who crossed him found their influence, slowly thinning not by sabotage, but by inattention. Their projects stalled, their requests delayed, their sectors reassigned to ease strain. And in time, they withdrew. Not because they were forced, because the system no longer recognized them as necessary. No blade, no duel, just distance. And those who aligned with him, they flourished, because he gave them space. Governors were granted wider authority. Trade envoys received full discretion. Military commanders were offered strategic independence. And in that trust, they became fiercely loyal. Because Vowrawn's genius wasn't in control. It was in making others believe they were free. Across former Sith space, the chaos of war faded, not because peace had been declared, but because decisions started making sense again. Budgets balanced, supplies moved. Holonet broadcasts returned to regular schedules. The people didn't chant his name in the streets, but they noticed that things worked. That was enough. Even in the Republic, diplomats shifted their tone. They no longer feared provocation. They feared embarrassment. Because every time Vowrawn spoke, he did so with such clarity that contradiction felt like ignorance. He would not raise a hand. He would simply smile and watch the conversation bend toward him. It wasn't charisma. It wasn't manipulation. It was refinement. His words felt correct. Because he said them slowly. Because he said them last. A Jedi emissary once described him as the calm we never trusted. A Mandalorian warlord simply called him untouchable. And one old Imperial officer, long retired, said the quiet part aloud. Vowrawn won, because he never looked like he needed to. He had become the face of a rebuilt Sith Order, one without a code, without temples, without fire, only motion. He let the people define his title. Emperor, architect, steward. None of them were wrong, because all of them pointed to the same truth. They followed him, not by force, but by relief, and he smiled through it all. Because they never understood. He had been smiling this whole time. Vowrawn never touched the levers directly. He didn't sign every decree. He didn't attend every briefing. He rarely spoke in public, yet everything moved as if orchestrated by an invisible hand. Appointments aligned, borders held. Plans unfolded exactly on schedule, without a single command given. That was the elegance. He didn't control things. He made them want to function. It wasn't mind trickery. It wasn't the Force. It was architecture. He had spent decades building a system that rewarded clarity and punished chaos not with lashes, but with delays. Those who acted with intent found their work elevated. Those who acted with pride found their efforts quietly folded into someone else's, and no one could trace the hand behind it, because it was never one hand. Vowrawn ruled through principles, not pressure, simplicity, consistency, privacy. He didn't just set policy, he set tone. The Empire, under his guidance, became quieter. Not less powerful, just less theatrical. It wasn't the Sith that changed. It was the rhythm beneath them. Lords still rose, still fell, still schemed, but the ones who survived were no longer the loudest. They were the ones who understood process, who built alliances without needing to draw blood, who learned that legacy meant little if your system failed in your absence. They became efficient. He met with them rarely, and when he did, he spoke like a tutor, not a sovereign. He offered anecdotes, not lectures, stories about long-dead lords who had lost everything through a single bad assumption. He never threatened. He never warned. He simply remembered, and those who listened stayed in power. Because the lesson was simple. Control doesn't begin at the top. It begins when the middle no longer needs permission to hold the structure together. That was what he had built, and in doing so, he had become the most powerful Sith the galaxy had seen in centuries. Not through fear, through absence. His control wasn't felt in the streets. It was felt in the silence after problems resolved themselves, in the way meetings ended early, in the way enemies stopped appearing, because he'd removed the need for them. Even the Jedi Council, reduced and quieted after years of war, began to take note, not through direct confrontation, but through the questions their students asked. Why does the Empire feel different now? Why are their colonies stable? Who's making these decisions? No one had answers, because Vowrawn didn't leave answers behind, only structure. That was the trick. He didn't rewrite the order. He refined it. He let old codes fade, let ancient rivalries cool. He didn't preach a new Sith doctrine. He didn't define a new vision. He simply removed the parts that no longer worked, and the order adjusted around him. And in doing so, he made himself inevitable. There was no counter to him, no revolution waiting. Because he gave people what they didn't know they needed, a galaxy that could breathe again. That wasn't mercy, that was design. Because if you build something strong enough, quiet enough, and elegant enough, it won't matter who rules it. It will rule itself. He ruled without fire. There were no massacres, no purges, no public executions meant to remind the galaxy of its place. The Sith had been built on fear for generations, but Vowrawn understood something none of his predecessors ever considered. Fear exhausts. Stability endures. His rule did not feel like an era. It felt like a breath the galaxy had finally been allowed to release. Former Zakulan territories traded freely again. Remnants of the Alliance dissolved into new governments. Even the Republic, fractured but breathing, found itself engaging with him in negotiations that didn't require a lightsaber resting on the table. He didn't pretend to seek peace. He simply didn't seek war. And that alone made the galaxy lean closer. He appeared in public only rarely. When he did, he wore robes of deep crimson trimmed with understated gold, a reminder of what he was, not a proclamation of it. His voice carried softly, as if volume itself were an outdated concept. There were no declarations, no manifestos, no speeches carved into history, just quiet clarity. When a conflict arose, he listened until the argument exhausted itself. Then he spoke a single line that unraveled everything, not by argument, but by precision. Does this strengthen us? Does it endure? Does it leave a scar we cannot afford? The questions were simple, but simplicity is sharp. In a galaxy that had grown tired of prophecy and screaming tyrants, simple questions held more power than threats. And as decades of disorder slowly faded, something strange began to happen. People began to trust him. Not love, not worship, trust. A rarity in Sith history so profound that some believed it was manipulation. Others believed it was mind control. But it wasn't. It was competence, the rarest force of all. He had spent his life surviving storms. Now he became shelter from them. Even Jedi emissaries admitted, in quiet conversations, that the new Sith Emperor felt more like a diplomat than a conqueror. They still did not trust the Sith, but they acknowledged something undeniable. The galaxy under Vowrawn was less cruel. That terrified many Sith. A softer empire, one without the roar of ancient rites, one where lords could not slaughter each other for prestige. To them, it felt like betrayal, a whisper of weakness. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Vowrawn had not softened the Sith, he had refined them. He had carved away chaos and left only function. He allowed ambition, but not anarchy. He allowed strength, but not spectacle. He allowed darkness, but not decay. And in doing so, he revealed what terrified the old guard most. Fire had never made the Sith strong. Structure had. He became the Emperor because the galaxy needed him. He remained Emperor because the galaxy no longer knew how to function without him. And yet, for all his elegance, for all his charm, for all the calm he brought to a broken era, something remained unchanged within him. The smile, not warmth, not joy, a quiet reminder that beneath the gentle rule, beneath the calm hand, beneath the soft voice, nothing inside him had ever changed. He was still the shadow who poisoned a table at 6 years old. Still the boy who smiled at lightning storms. Still the man who erased rivals with silence. He was Emperor without fire, because he had always known. Fire burns too fast, but shadows endure. The war did not end, it unraveled. There was no treaty, no decisive battle, no throne shattered before the people. It simply wore itself thin. The Galactic Republic remained stubborn, bruised but breathing. The Sith Empire, once towering and ruthless, began to feel its weight not through defeat, but through time. And time is a quiet killer. Vowrawn had ruled longer than anyone expected, longer than he himself had planned. But even shadows stretch and thin when the sun refuses to set. And this war had no sun, no night. Just flickers of fire across distant systems that no longer remembered what they were fighting for. His commanders wanted escalation. More troops, more funding, more strikes against Republic supply lines. But Vowrawn gave them stillness. He delayed, stalled, sent them on diplomatic runs instead. Assigned them to regions with no strategic value. Not because he wanted surrender, but because he saw what they didn't. The Empire was bleeding and hiding the wound. Factories slowed without announcing it. Communications failed and never recovered. Recruitment drives returned empty ships. The Order was shrinking not from war, but exhaustion, and he refused to pretend otherwise. So, he planned backward. He studied old doctrines, researched names long erased. He moved funds into places no one looked: education, planetary autonomy, minor fleet maintenance. While others sharpened blades, Vowrawn prepared archives. Because he knew the truth. The Sith were no longer building an empire. They were burying one. And he would decide what remained. The council, now reduced to whispers and empty seats, no longer challenged him. They saw the same horizon he did. Some fled, others begged for unity. One tried to seize power and vanished before his ship could leave orbit. Vowrawn let the fear spread, let the silence grow, because fear was useful, and silence was structure. He continued to smile, not as deception but as ritual. It grounded him. The war reports were still read aloud every morning, but no one listened. The war had become background noise, a shape with no center, a performance carried on only because no one knew how to leave the stage. But Vowrawn had already stepped back. He no longer held court. His appearances were rare, even among his own agents. When he spoke, it was through sealed directives, final, flawless, and impossible to question. He didn't need to be seen. He had become function, and function survives. On Dromund Kaas, the rain still fell. The lightning still cracked the sky in quiet remembrance of old storms. But the towers were quieter, fewer lights, fewer screams. Even the dark side itself felt thinner. The Force no longer trembled with ambition. It simply watched. And so did Vowrawn. Because for the first time in centuries, the Sith had no future, no prophecy, no grand plan to crush the Jedi. All that remained was legacy. He saw it clearly now, what others never could. Victory was never permanent. Conquest always rotted. But memory could be designed. He didn't need the Sith to win. He needed them to be remembered correctly. Not as tyrants, not as monsters, but as inevitabilities. He began building something different. Not a weapon, not a doctrine, a record. Because the war would forget them. But he wouldn't. No one ever saw him age. His skin never sagged. His voice never cracked. The robes he wore were always perfect, his posture always tall. There were no visible infirmities, no signs of illness or decline. It was not because Vowrawn could stop the passage of time, it was because he had trained himself to make time irrelevant. He was older than most of his advisors, older than many of the ships still flying under Imperial banners. But he had become something else, something separate, not immortal, not divine, just enduring. The galaxy whispered that he must have consumed a dark ritual or siphoned life from others. But the truth was less dramatic and far more terrifying. He aged with intent. Every wrinkle, every strand of silver in his hair, every motion of his hands was chosen, deliberate, like the pages of a book turned only when the reader willed it. Because emperors could not falter, they could not appear hesitant, weak, or burdened by time. And so Vowrawn simply refused to. Even as the war dragged on, even as his empire frayed, he projected something more dangerous than power. Stillness. It terrified the ambitious. It frustrated the Jedi, and it confused his enemies. How could someone who had ruled through chaos now rule through quiet? He didn't rage. He adjusted. His private chambers were now smaller, not by necessity but by design. The grand throne rooms of the past were left empty. Now, he met with lords in soft-lit rooms with one chair and no echoes. He no longer gave orders in person. His words arrived in written form, sealed in deep crimson. Once opened, the message vanished within minutes, a reminder that even his language obeyed decay. But the mind behind it never slowed. Vowrawn still knew everything, still saw everything. He just no longer reacted with fury, only correction. A Sith Lord who launched an unauthorized invasion found their army reassigned within days. A spy who betrayed a hidden archive disappeared mid-transmission. Her body never recovered. A moth who whispered rebellion was invited to Cast City and never returned. No threats, no public warnings, just decisions, clean, wordless, final. That was how an emperor aged, by becoming quieter, sharper, closer to myth than man. In his solitude, he began reviewing names, not enemies, not allies, just names, old ones, forgotten ones, apprentices who had vanished, rivals who never rose high enough to challenge him. He sent no messages, just remembered them. Because history, to him, was not a list, it was a library, and libraries were not meant to burn. So he started preserving old data shards, broken holocrons, journals written in dead tongues, all of it gathered quietly, placed in deep vaults under the citadel, places that had not been opened since the days of Naga Sado. Some called it a legacy project. Others believed it was the act of a dying man. But they didn't understand. He wasn't preserving himself. He was preserving the structure, the shape of power, the formula of Sith endurance, not the violence, but the logic, because he knew the war would end. He knew the Empire would fall. But he also knew something else. It would return. Different name, different face, but it would come. And when it did, someone would find what he left behind. Not a throne, not a crown, a blueprint, because emperors cannot age. They can only disappear. And what disappears is remembered. Legacy was not glory. Not for Vowrawn. Not anymore. Glory could be erased. Statues crumbled. Holo records lost signal. Even great empires once built through blood and terror could vanish in a single shift of the galaxy's memory. He had watched it happen. He had watched Zakul, once an invincible golden empire, dissolve in the span of a few years. He had watched the Eternal Fleet turn from unstoppable to irrelevant. He had seen the Republic fall, rise, and fall again. And through it all, he understood a truth few dared accept. If something can be destroyed, it will be. So he chose to build what could not. It began quietly. A restructuring of archives, a reclassification of systems, a reassignment of roles that seemed random at first glance, but became a pattern over time. He was not consolidating power. He was preparing it to survive him. His advisors begged him to expand the army, to retake sectors lost to the Republic, to declare a new crusade, one that would remind the galaxy why the Sith had ruled in the first place. But Vowrawn refused. Because war was noise, and noise is forgotten. Structure endures. He shifted the Empire's focus inward to education, infrastructure, cultural preservation, programs the Sith had traditionally ignored, scorning them as weaknesses. But Vowrawn knew better. Power was not in domination. It was in continuity. He restored the academies, not to train soldiers, but thinkers. He reopened Sith historical vaults, not as monuments, but as lessons. Young acolytes were taught strategy, art, diplomacy skills once considered beneath the Sith, now essential. Some called it betrayal, but they misunderstood. Vowrawn was not softening the Sith, he was sharpening them. He removed lords who failed to adapt, not through execution that was too easy, too quick, too forgettable. Instead, he erased their influence, their duties distributed, their records sealed, their memories dissolved into footnotes. Their power didn't die. It was absorbed, a living archive, his archive, because the future would not belong to those who burned the brightest. It would belong to those who left behind the clearest map. And Vowrawn drew maps in silence. He created redundancies in every system, multiple fail-safes. hidden protocols that would activate if certain sectors fell, decentralized command structures that could operate even if the capital was destroyed. It was not the work of a conqueror. It was the work of a man building a spine. And then, he did something no Sith Emperor had ever dared. He weakened his own title. He broke it into functions, distributed authority, gave entire regions autonomy. If one lord fell, 10 more systems could still breathe. If one fleet was destroyed, 3 backup networks could take over. It confused his enemies. It unsettled his allies. It terrified the council remnants. Because the more he decentralized the empire, the more it depended on him. Only he understood the full design. Only he could see how every line curved back to its center. He wasn't holding the empire together through power. He held it together through knowledge. And knowledge does not die with the body. He spent hours alone in his study, surrounded by old data pads, reviewing, refining, removing names that did not matter, adding those that would matter long after he was gone. He wrote nothing of himself. No memoirs, no proclamations, no final testament, because the greatest legacy is the one without an author. What must be left behind is what no one can undo. In the final years of his rule, Vowrawn felt something he had never allowed himself to recognize before. An ending, not sudden, not tragic, a slow dimming like the last ember of a long burning fire. He was not dying, not in the physical sense, but he could feel the line of the old Sith blood thinning, the traditions fading, the rituals losing meaning, the very identity of the empire shifting beneath his feet. And he knew he could not stop it, because nothing remains untouched by time, not even the dark. The council was gone in all but name. The remaining lords were young, powerful, and unfocused, raised in a galaxy too fractured to understand the weight of history. They did not revere the old ways. They did not fear the mistakes of past generations. And they did not feel the quiet tremor that Vowrawn felt every night as he walked the silent halls of Kar City. The Sith were becoming something else. Not weaker, not stronger, just different. The blood that had once defined them, the cruelty, the ambition, the ritual had spread too thin to reclaim. And in that realization, Vowrawn saw the truth he had been avoiding. He was the last of them, not the last Sith. Many would come after, but the last of the old blood, the generation shaped by Vitiate's shadow, sharpened by the great galactic war, tempered by the chaos of Zakuul's golden age. A lineage forged in terror and refined in silence. And like all old blood, it would disappear. So he prepared for that too. He stopped attending military briefings, stopped reviewing fleet reports, stopped intervening in the petty rivalries of rising lords. He allowed the empire to breathe, without him allowed it to test its own bones. Some thought he was growing frail. Some thought he was losing interest. Some thought he was preparing for death. But Vowrawn was preparing for absence. He began withdrawing himself from records, erasing traces of his authorship, hiding the maps he had drawn into distributed vaults, removing his name from historical registers. His signature vanished from half of the Empire's restored documents. It was not humility. It was strategy. Because the moment a name becomes essential, the galaxy finds a way to kill it. His systems, his structures, his design, they could survive him only if no one knew where they ended and where he began. He became a rumor again, a whisper in meeting halls, a suggestion attached to strategies no one knew the origin of. He smiled as he dismantled himself. Even on the days when the war reports were bleak, even when another sector fell, Even when younger Sith challenged his reforms, he smiled, not to hide fear, but to acknowledge the irony. He had spent his life thriving in shadows. Now he was becoming one. And in the quiet of his final twilight, Vowrawn understood something with perfect clarity. The old blood could not return, because he would not let it. The cycle of destruction, throne after throne, purge after purge, war after war, would die with him. Not because he defeated it, but because he refused to leave behind a system that allowed it to grow again. He walked through the empty throne room one last time. No crown, no guards, no grand finale. Only the echo of every decision he had made, whispering through the cold air like a memory the Force itself could not quite hold. He placed one hand on the stone, not in farewell, in confirmation. The Empire no longer needed the old blood. It no longer needed him. And that was the victory no Sith before him had ever achieved. He didn't fear being forgotten. He designed it. Because the greatest Emperor is the one whose legacy survives without his name. No funeral, no broadcast, no witness to speak of his passing. Vowrawn, the last Sith Emperor, left behind nothing but echoes. In the years after the collapse of the Sith Empire, silence became his final weapon. His enemies searched for him, rivals, Republic agents, even the few remaining Sith Lords who once feared him. They found nothing. No grave, no temple, no tomb carved into obsidian stone. Only stories, only whispers. But that was how he had always moved, just outside the reach of certainty. He didn't vanish like vitiate, consumed by power and reborn through death. He didn't die in battle, flanked by guards and drowned in glory. He simply stepped backward into shadow, as if he'd never been there at all. And that's what terrified the galaxy most, because people remembered his voice. They remembered how he never shouted, never threatened. His commands were gentle, even elegant, but they were obeyed. Entire systems bowed without violence. Generals defected after a single conversation, and senators who never met him still voted in his favor. The galaxy had seen hundreds of Sith Lords die. Most screamed, most begged, a few burned, but none of them left behind this kind of stillness. Some believed he had orchestrated his own disappearance, not to escape death, but to control what came after it. His policies remained, his networks endured, his agents, faceless and loyal, continued to operate without his voice. The Empire didn't crumble when he vanished. It slowed, it quieted, it evolved. And in the quiet, people began to realize the truth. Vowrawn had never needed to conquer anything. He had simply learned to infect systems. He didn't want thrones. He wanted patterns, habits, a galaxy that would keep repeating his will long after he was gone. No statue would be built for him. No archive would hold his memoirs. But you could still feel him in the way certain governors refused to trust Jedi, in the way former enemies refused to unite. He had rewired the galaxy, thought by thought. Even the Republic's historians couldn't agree on how his rule ended. Some said he died of age. Others claimed he had moved off-world to a hidden observatory beyond wild space. A few, the quietest few, insisted he was still alive, speaking through proxies, shaping events, never needing a name. And the Sith, they said even less. Because for the first time in history, a Sith Lord had proven something horrifying, that you didn't need to survive to win. You only needed to become the silence that others listened to. And so, when the records closed and the last official log marked his absence, there was no celebration, no final war. Just a galaxy that kept moving, exactly as he had planned. No decree ever named Vowrawn the last Sith Emperor, but the galaxy did. Not because of title or bloodline, not because he ruled the longest, but because when his voice faded, no one knew what to do next. He had built something more permanent than rule, something deeper than fear. His legacy was not carved into stone or pressed into coins. It was written in behavior, in hesitation, in the way people spoke a little quieter in council chambers, even decades after he vanished. His greatest act of power wasn't war, it was continuity. Most Sith left behind flames, burned fleets, collapsed orders, shattered temples, but Vowrawn left behind systems that kept working, not out of loyalty, but because they didn't know how to do anything else. He had changed the way the Empire thought, down to its reflexes. Bureaucrats still followed protocols he authored. Generals still used strategies he'd only hinted at in passing. Even spies who never met him operated inside networks he'd designed. It was like watching a ghost manage the present. What disturbed some was how peaceful it all felt. No terror, no purges, no succession war. Just an absence. A quiet space where power had once lived. And in that quiet, those who studied him began to understand what he had truly built. He didn't create an empire. He created momentum. He aligned the galaxy's wheels to spin without him. And that's why his influence lasted longer than most Jedi grandmasters. He didn't fight the current. He reshaped it until it flowed in directions only he could see. And when it came time to step away, he didn't resist. He let go, not because he was tired, but because letting go was the final move. He had always known what the others hadn't. Power didn't have to be visible to exist, and permanence didn't require recognition. The galaxy had spent millennia trying to define strength by violence, territory, or blood. Vowrawn saw through all of that. He chose the kind of legacy that couldn't be killed, because it couldn't be found. A legacy buried inside decisions made by people who didn't even know his name. Even Jedi historians, searching for meaning in the decades after his disappearance, admitted something quietly in their texts. That somewhere out there, something of him was still shaping things. And it wasn't the Force. It was intention, a perfectly placed whisper, a system without a master, a lesson no one noticed they were still following. And across the stars, those echoes still moved. Not loudly, not violently, but steadily, patiently, the way he had always moved. They didn't speak his name anymore, but they still followed his rules. Across the Outer Rim, trade networks negotiated with outdated Sith treaties ones Vowrawn had brokered long before his disappearance. On Dromund Kaas, the shattered ruins of government still operated under invisible constraints, designed not to inspire faith, but to prevent rebellion. No one knew who had written the old instructions, but they all obeyed them. And that was the point. He never wanted recognition, not truly. He wanted compliance, predictability, outcomes. If a planet surrendered without understanding why, that was power. If a senator voted out of fear of a presence that wasn't even there, that was control. If two enemies didn't ally because something unseen warned them not to, that was Vowrawn. His systems weren't made of wires and commands. They were human, cultural. He'd taught leaders how to think, and then let them believe those thoughts were their own. And the beauty of it was that they still thought that. Even years later, military logistics, inheritance codes, Sith political etiquette all still bore his fingerprint. Not because anyone was preserving his legacy, but because removing his work would have broken everything. The Empire needed his systems like lungs need air. They couldn't imagine another way. And in time, even that truth was forgotten. To most of the galaxy, Vowrawn became a myth, a soft-spoken emperor who never raised his voice, never left a corpse behind, never made demands. And yet, he became the opposite of what a Sith was supposed to be. And maybe that's why the systems lasted, because they didn't feel Sith. They felt natural, useful, efficient. But if you truly traced them, every pathway of power, every loophole, every built-in delay, every quiet collapse that allowed a rival to fall, it all went back to him. Even the Republic, after its victories, found itself copying his models. Civilian surveillance reforms, strategic diplomacy protocols, quiet backdoor negotiations. Not out of respect, but out of practicality. They didn't know he had already shaped the field they thought they were mastering. He had no monument, no statue, but the machines still ran on his design. And in a strange way, that became his immortality. Not through the Force, not through legend, through infrastructure, the kind no one notices, the kind no one can remove. Even when his name vanished from reports, his decisions still walked the halls. And some whispered, behind closed doors, he may be gone, but he never left. No one knew when he smiled last. Some said it happened in his throne room, long after the guards had left, just a quiet curl of the lips as he surveyed a galaxy finally moving without him. Others believed his final smile came on a distant world, walking through an empty market at dusk, hidden beneath a hood as he listened to ordinary people speak of peace they never expected to feel. But the truth is simpler. His last smile wasn't seen, it was felt. Because the moment Vowrawn vanished, the galaxy didn't shatter like it once had under the deaths of other Sith Lords. There was no panic, no collapse, no second war. Everything kept moving. Predictable, quiet, balanced. It was the only confirmation he ever wanted. His life had not been about fear, domination, or immortality. It had been about control without presence, power without display, influence without fingerprints. And he achieved it. When historians tried to define his rule, they couldn't agree. They labeled him a reformer, a manipulator, an accidental stabilizer, a hidden tyrant, a necessary leader. But they all missed the truth. He never cared how he was remembered. He cared how the galaxy behaved after he was gone. The Republic rebuilt. The Jedi reformed. The Sith scattered, then reorganized under new philosophies. But nowhere did the galaxy return to the chaos that had shaped Vowrawn's youth. Because he had carved new instincts into its foundations. People tolerated fewer tyrants. Governments adopted quieter strategies. War became less frequent, less glorious, less desired. His shadow stayed behind, not as a threat, but as a reminder. That stability had a shape, and it had been his. Some searched for him in the unknown regions. Others whispered he had achieved what vitiate never could, anonymity powerful enough to outlive mortality. A few believed he still walked among them, observing, smiling softly at how well everything was holding together. But whether he lived or died no longer mattered, because legends aren't measured by presence, they're measured by echo. And Vowrawn's echo stretched farther than any empire he ever ruled. Not in monuments, not in holocrons, in choices, in routines, in the subtle way leaders paused before making a mistake, as if a voice, gentle and amused, whispered from somewhere just behind them. Not that way, not fear, not warning, guidance. And that was the truth that finally settled over the stars. He hadn't been a conqueror. He hadn't been a savior. He hadn't even been the strongest Sith of his era. He was the one who understood something none of the others ever grasped. That winning wasn't about destroying enemies. It wasn't about ruling forever. It wasn't about the Force. Winning was about leaving the galaxy unable to forget your rhythm. And when the dark finally settled, when the last empire he touched drifted into history, one thing remained, a memory shaped like a smile, soft as shadow, patient as breath, quiet as victory, a smile that outlived empires and will outlive many more.